Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the fanfiction guy, back with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Deku Unlocked Opha's True Potential. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. It wasn't that Toshinori disliked children. Actually, he found a lot of his motivation for hero work in children. As the frequent targets of villains, nothing could be more rewarding to Toshinori than saving a children from imminent doom. Whatever the child was destined to be, whether an accountant, a doctor, a retail agent, or a hero, nothing outweighed the value of saving that future from oblivion. Still, being in his hero form around children who were not in the immediate throes of possible death was, well, more uncomfortable than he was willing to admit. All Might, a little girl squealed, clutching her piccolo, or flute. Toshinori could never quite tell the difference, and clinging to his sleeve for dear life. Her eyes shone as she exclaimed, "Please give me your autograph." Toshinori didn't allow his broad smile to falter, but he chuckled uneasily. He'd lost count of how many other kids had parroted the exact question. Still, he agreed easily to her request and pulled out his favorite sparkly ink pen. Villains truly were despicable. Toshinori had almost not wanted to believe the tip he'd received. Just a couple hours earlier, new intel had streamed in, informing one of his assistants of the impending villain attack on a local primary school's winter recital. The villain in question, who was alleged to have a warp or insane speed quirk, had been laying siege on the municipality ever since April. Not only was he extremely strong, but he was also smart and slippery. Since no hero had been able to apprehend him yet, they'd just been playing at their best damage control tactics. Toshinori fully expected the warp villain's reign of terror to end today, at his hands. In fact, he was almost infinitely more worried about the droves of children attaching and detaching themselves from him like a jungle gym than the murderous villain. If all children share the same one trait, its predictability, Toshinori thought to himself wryly. How can they all be so precious, yet so similar in their demands? It was all the same, monotonous work. Toshinori certainly thought the children were cute and would definitely do anything to protect them from harm, but the same request from 26 different children just got so redundant. Toshinori sighed in relief when, almost as if by telepathic communication, all the children in their shiny black band costumes began marching toward the auditorium. He glanced at his watch, which blinked, 5:54 p.m. It must be their call time. Like moths gleefully racing towards a candle, Toshinori watched as the sea of black forms and bobbing heads converged and disappeared through grandiose, swinging doors. He expelled a short, heavy breath, lowering his head in a show of gratitude toward the cosmos. "Are you okay?" Toshinori straightened, suddenly aware of his vulnerable stance. As Yagi Toshinori, a crooked back and exhausted disposition would suit his exterior perfectly. As All Might, it was uncomfortably contradictory. The voice wasn't accusatory, though, or confused, or awed, the three prime reactions that would befit the current situation. All Might was not the type to be slumped over in a primary school courtyard, after all. The voice tried again. "Are you okay? You seem tired, so I was wondering if you were lost." In fact, the voice wasn't just not awed. It instead seemed curiously, innocently, bizarrely concerned. He turned around to glance at its owner, fully expecting some sort of confused parent. Sometimes, he reasoned, overzealous mothers had a tendency to treat anyone, even full-grown men, like children. But it wasn't a mother, or even a grown-up looking up, he corrected as he craned his neck down to get a good look at him, but in fact, it was a small child. His eyes, inked with a deep shade of emerald green, blinked up at him. The boy's face was soft and round, the gentle curvature giving him a decidedly effeminate look. This was mirrored by the pull of his pale mouth and his thick eyelashes. The boy blinked again. "You're very tall," he commented, a little stupidly. "Do you need help?" Toshinori glanced down at himself self-consciously. He wondered if he had unconsciously slipped back into his real form. Such a thing would explain the way the boy casually addressed him. Is he disinterested in heroes? Toshinori glanced at the boy again. His fists were clenched and wobbling, his face glowing with a muted reverence. "No, that's not it. He's just restraining himself admirably. The boy looked down, his eyes now hidden under thick, vibrantly green curls. I'm all might, he responded dumbly, not sure of what else to say. The boy pet his head, looking a bit confused himself. I know. I asked if you needed help? The boy wondered aloud. Do heroes all have some sort of built-in GPS system that tells them where to go for school recitals? Toshinori tried to stop himself, but he let out a quick, booming laugh. I suppose not. Excellent observation, my boy. Toshinori wasn't lost, but he felt his heart open suddenly for the boy who had asked All Might whether he was okay, instead of asking for an autograph. He wasn't lost, but he found himself drawn to the boy's innocence and politeness. Lead the way then. Izuku, the boy, who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, supplied easily. All Might noticed for the first time, amidst black sleeves that were much too long for Izuku's hands, that he gripped a long, thin, clarinet-looking instrument in one hand and wrinkled white sheet music in the other hand. It only made sense that Izuku was also performing in the recital, but for some reason, All Might found himself impressed by the child once more. Izuku began to carefully pick his way toward the auditorium, with Toshinori taking up a stride to his left. Noticed how light Izuku's steps were, how graceful his movements were. He moved like a dancer. Toshinori found himself getting excited in spite of himself. The darkness in the auditorium provided a welcome respite from the wandering, incessant eyes that fixed themselves upon Toshinori wherever he went. Rather than stares, he simply got to listen to the hushed whispers of the parents in the auditorium. Since his quirk could be used to enhance hearing, or any single one of his senses, he got a general feel for what they were saying. My daughter is doing so well at the piano. Oh, what was his quirk again? What are we having for dinner tonight? Indeed, the sheer normality of most all conversations in the room were a source of comfort and frustration for Toshinori. He supposed he would be having more fun if he, too, had a child to look out for on the stage. He shifted awkwardly in a folding chair that was too small for him, wishing for not the first time tonight that the villain would have chosen a different location to execute his evil schemes. It was growing harder and harder for Toshinori to remember why he had come, anyways, amidst all his many discomforts. Don't be silly, he chided himself, realizing the sheer frequency of his self-pitying remarks. You've dealt with worse and will surely encounter much more horrible situations in the future. The assurance, however, didn't reduce the pain in his backside. A dramatic hush fell over the auditorium, silencing any and all normal conversations, as the heavy navy curtain shrouding the stage was gradually pulled away. On the stage, a stout man with a light baton flailed his arms, expressing a dramatic greeting to the audience, whereas the small group of students brandishing instruments shifted uncomfortably in their chairs behind him. It really was a small group, no more than 30 children, for sure, meaning that the vast majority of them had already singled him out for an autograph right beforehand. He sighed, supposing it had been a small price to repay them for the inevitable trauma and chaos that was soon to occur at their recital. Toshinori spotted Izuku immediately. It wasn't hard to, considering his shock of green hair, and the fact that he was sitting in the first row, in the first seat. Protruding from his clarinet was a long piece of bare wood, which Toshinori was fairly sure was not an indigenous feature of the clarinet. Toshinori kept his eyes on the boy, a little captivated by his posture and stern, concentrated look. The short conductor man continued to express his deepest gratitude for their attendance, even trying his hand at a few ill-received jokes. Toshinori, for his part, bellowed with laughter on cue. The conductor grimaced visibly. "Thank you, random jovial stranger," he exclaimed before making a, without further ado, motion and turning his back on the audience. The conductor lifted a finger, and the instruments of the children rose wordlessly. They were well-trained and skilled, like tiny heroes in their own right. Their first piece was a quick-paced march. For all of Toshinori's limited musical knowledge, they were distinctively, well, juvenile musicians. Their timing was off and their tone was questionable. However, Toshinori was impressed with their vigilance, how they tapped their feet critically to the beat, the way they kept flicking their eyes back and forth between their stands and the conductor's bouncy baton. Toshinori kept conveniently forgetting the impending villain attack. I should go to the theater more often, he thought. The second song was a slow, lullaby-ish melodic piece. It didn't begin without a few hiccups, and the overall song was plain, but Toshinori soon began picking up on a rogue solo slowly beginning to emerge from the cacophony of instruments. Haunting was the only word fit to describe the solo. It was hauntingly beautiful. Though slow and simple, the simple coloration of the melody brought prickling tears to his eyes. Soon, the other noises were stripped away, and the melody pierced alone through the auditorium air. There was almost a frightened, awed silence among the parents, as the last note faded away to silence. Toshinori put too much energy into his applause, probably frightening the children, but his applause was only revitalized as the conductor motioned for Izuku to stand. Izuku looked slight and small on the inky black stage. His head certainly looked larger than his body from a distance. Izuku bowed, looking a little uncomfortable at the raucous applause, and quickly sat down again. The conductor reassumed his position, looking ready to conduct again. It was then that the wall exploded, and a plume of sawdust and drywall erupted, misting the auditorium and blinding the audience completely. There was a beat of terrified silence, during which Toshinori had the foresight to boom, "Get down, everyone!" Toshinori fixed his eyes to the cloud of drywall dust, expecting a villain with a nasty warp quirk. Instantly thereafter, not one, but a swarm of villains stormed into the auditorium. He clapped a hand to his forehead. Intel is usually not so drastically incorrect, he thought, pressing a finger to his watch. Calling for other heroes, it informed him, before Toshinori lowered his wrist. Toshinori could probably take down all the villains, and Toshinori could probably save all the civilians, but doing both at the same time? The civilians were the only ones who could lose in that conceited gamble. On the stage, where Toshinori couldn't help but glance, being that it was the most concentrated source of vulnerable, innocent, frightened children, Izuku's hair was gleaming lime in the spotlight. Toshinori noticed that his legs were quaking, expectedly, and his face looked very pale. The hero felt his heart twist in sympathy. But something was odd. He stood atop the podium where his stodgy conductor had once been. He wondered where the man had fled to, and his mouth, instead of being clenched shut in terror, was moving rapidly. Toshinori squinted to see Izuku's brow, furrowed in conversation, and the concentrated expression in his eyes. Toshinori realized that he must be fervently speaking to the other children. Instructing them? Leading them? Some of the children were crying, but most were nodding determinedly. Toshinori forced himself to focus, shaking his head with a small smile. Izuku was frightened, but he was still doing his best to help and direct the other children. It was like he was made to be a hero. Maybe that was why he felt his eyes flicking back and forth between the task at hand and Izuku. Maybe that was why even when he faced the villains to strike, the image of the tiny grade schooler who fought his fears to guide other children was seared into his mind. He powered up one for all, and, in a characteristic brute force approach, charged into a motley fray of evildoers. Toshinori was panting. The bodies, all unconscious, not dead, Toshinori was a hero, not a vigilante, were rapidly piling up around him as he swung many a powered-up fist. Again, his fist connected with the jaw of a nasty-looking villain with a jagged scar stretching across his nose. The whites of his eyes were pricked with an uncomfortable reddish-black color, which from a distance implied that the whites didn't actually exist at all. Toshinori grimaced as the villain crumpled to the ground like a sack of wet laundry. It was clear neither he or many of his allies were incredibly powerful or astute villains. And yet, they continued to attack him tirelessly. Toshinori found more trouble weaving his way through the growing stacks of unconscious bodies than actually defeating the villains themselves. Why all this? He wondered, certainly not for the first time in the past 6 minutes. Toshinori concentrated another surge of one for all, when his fist met the abdomen of a tall, lanky, black-haired man with a short knife. The man flew backward and toppled over 2 other enemies. This is a school recital. This makes no sense at all. Despite the outrageous number of villains, Toshinori noted that he was holding the line quite well all on his own. Most of the parents and teachers had evacuated the seats, And, Toshinori noted with a small degree of pride, it seemed like Izuku had succeeded in rallying the students and leading them to safety. He heard a hiss through the crowd. Where? What is going on? Where are the reinforcements? To lead such a vast quantity of villains to attack a school recital point blank was ridiculous even for the most brainless organization head on the planet. Toshinori dodged in and out of the slow grips of villains who seemed to care less and less about landing hits and more about suffocating him with sheer numbers. It was no use because his power was too great, but it was still annoying. He swept a hand, which seethed with One for All's power, horizontally across his vision. It created a shockwave which propelled half a dozen attackers away from him. The domino effect was as amusing as it was disturbing, as his competition seemed to be as easy to blow over as paper. Just leave. If you just are trying to annoy me, Toshinori grunted, pushing away another aggressor who vehemently swatted at his face in response. And then they did. It was bizarre. The villains, even the ones he had knocked down, ped their heads to the side, as if heeding some unseen master, and began trudging towards the hole that they had crawled out of. Toshinori looked left and right in distress, grabbing onto the shirt of one woman sporting a bright pink eye patch and missing one of her front teeth. "What are you doing? What have you done?" he demanded. "Why?" She simply put on a crooked grin and looked at him innocently. "We just got what we came for, hero." And then she spat in Toshinori's face. He released her out of surprise and bewilderment. "No," a distant voice shrieked, and the door to the auditorium practically flew off of its hinges. Panting in the doorway, stood Izuku, his face tear-stricken, and face morphed into an ugly frown that only young children could pull off. His forehead was streaming blood. They must have sent off more to attack the children, Toshinori realized, distressed. He was such a fool. Why hadn't he stayed with the children to begin with? "Don't take her!" Izuku yelled, his voice an octave higher than it had been in their earlier conversation. His green eyes scanned the room as soon as he entered. He was bouncing up and down like he was intoxicated. A hostage? Toshinori thought. Izuku's eyes, filled with panic, flicked over to Toshinori's briefly. Toshinori's heart broke to see such a talented, brave, and composed child exposed to such terror. He clenched his fist, motivated once again. But Izuku was acting strangely. All of a sudden his room scanning stopped, and he flung his tiny form up the stairs to the stage. His footsteps pounded in the relative silence, until finally, he jumped off the stage. Toshinori activated One for All, sprinting so quickly toward the little boy that he felt like he could break several sound barriers, but he fell so fast. Then his body sprung backward, as if deflected by empty air. Toshinori winced at the empty thud as Izuku was slammed against the wall, his head ricocheting off of the brick, and his body slumping in onto himself. Izuku, if it were possible, looked even smaller than before. Toshinori was horrified, and doubly so by the apparition that materialized in the empty space that Izuku had leapt for. It was a stringy, almost mangy man, with his coarse fingers deep in the greenish hair of a little girl clad in concert attire. Everything about the man screamed low life, from his bad posture to his reddish eyes, to the whites of which were riddled with the same peculiar dots and lines of the earlier villains, to long wolfish claws that protruded from each finger. The man yawned. "This is the kid you saw in your future vision, right, boss?" He ped his head to one side as if listening. "What do you mean you think? Wasn't it an effeminate little green-haired twerp who is supposed to rule the rankings in the future? This kid," he jostled the little girl, whose wide black eyes were tinged with tears, "looks to fit the description." The villain fixed his eyes on Toshinori. "Sorry, All Might, but I'll be making my way out now, and if you try to stop me..." Toshinori clenched his muscles, preparing to leap towards the villain, and he vanished. Toshinori sputtered, swiping the air where the villain and the little girl had been in a rage. An invisibility quirk. Those usually had a tell, whether it be the air rippling or an off-color background or something like that, but by the time he figured that out the girl would be gone forever. "All Might!" A voice screamed. "Over here!" Toshinori spun around toward the voice, and Izuku, somehow pulling himself up from his prostrate position against the wall, had his tiny arms firmly wrapped around the villain. He can't disappear when somebody is touching him. Izuku gasped. Toshinori wondered frantically how a child could have known that, or figured it out so quickly, or acted on it so spectacularly. For the nth time that evening, Toshinori was impressed by Izuku. The villain was looking down, not struggling to escape yet out of shock. He scoffed, freeing one arm from the weak grip of an 8-year-old. With a quick flash of steel, he twisted his arm and planted a knife in Izuku's chest. Toshinori was already in front of him, though, and with the power of one for all coursing through him like magma, he slammed a fist into the villain's face. He felt like he could have left a crater there where facial features once had been. The anger coursing through him was like nothing he'd felt in a long, long time. The villain outstretched a hand as he flew backward, and one of his nails flew off of his hand like a miniature knife and embedded itself in Toshinori's forearm. It was nothing more than a graze, but an affront nonetheless. The girl that he had been holding onto sat down hard, black eyes staring off into space. Terrified into passivity, maybe? Toshinori paused for a beat, wondering what to say to her, before remembering Izuku. His body flooded with passion, rage, and despair. He was quirkless, the girl whispered suddenly. He was quirkless, so why would he, over any of the others, he was quirkless? Toshinori didn't respond, kneeling down to Izuku. He was breathing heavily, and his eyes were sewn shut in pain. He was smiling. It was slight and weak, but there nonetheless. She's fine, Toshinori promised, heart filled with fear. The dagger had been plunged very deep. Toshinori had seen wounds like this before. Adults didn't survive them, and grade schoolers wouldn't either. Izuku closed his mouth, effort expended. His last effort expended on inquiring whether someone else was all right. Why is he? Izuku's pants grew weaker and weaker with every passing moment. Why is he so much like me? And then, I would have had a boy like him as my successor. Toshinori laid a gentle arm on the knife wound in Izuku's chest, feeling for a heartbeat. He saw the implanted little dagger in his own forearm, still streaming blood lightly, mixing his blood with Izuku's like their wounds were at all comparable. He criticized himself. He hated himself. He could have survived Izuku's wounds. Toshinori, in that moment, would have done anything to reverse their positions, to be the one laying on the floor in agony, dying. So much potential in such a small vessel. So much potential lost to his inadequacy. Izuku's heart stopped. And the room exploded in green fire. It wasn't until much, much later that Toshinori would see this for what it truly was, a wealth of power exploding out from a vessel not properly trained to contain it. Izuku was not an unreasonable child. His mother had told him so several times. He knew what unreasonable children looked like too. He saw kids pulling at their mom's arm in stores furiously, pointing at a little gimmicky toy and demanding that their greed be sated. He watched Kaken bully and beat other kids into SBMs just to prove a point. He noticed how other kids couldn't resist bragging about their new quirks to him, how they couldn't understand how the absence of his own quirk hurt him more and more every day. Izuku was not an unreasonable child, and he did not exaggerate. So, he hoped that All Might, or God, or his mom, or whoever was out there maybe looking out for him, would believe him when he said that he was swimming in lava. Even then, that was a mild way of putting the sensation that surrounded him. Izuku couldn't quite justify calling it heat, even. It was pure feeling, raw passion, drowning him in some sort of power, some heavy aura. It hurts, Izuku whimpered, not sure if the noise was even escaping his mouth. Even his vision was being drowned in something, because he wasn't able to make out actual shapes. His vision contorted in interesting combinations of colors, predominantly reds and oranges. It was like muted stars had infiltrated his head, the way that the colors poked his consciousness painfully. Then something brushed his arm. Izuku flinched, the something retreated. Then, it grasped his shoulder more insistently, and Izuku reacted. A surge of green something, not exactly flame, not exactly electricity, just simple power, erupted from his arm as he lashed out blindly toward the touch. He sensed his arm connect with something, and felt immediate regret at his primal, self-serving reaction. Izuku's vision began to clear, and he realized that he was still in the auditorium, still trapped in that moment that seemed so long ago. All Might was standing several feet away from him, mouth agape. Izuku wondered idly if he had something on his face. Then, as more of the auditorium came into view, he began uncomfortably aware of the fact that it was uncannily singed. The once white and gray room was blackened beyond recognition, the tapestries on the wall reduced to ashes and the cushions on the seats obliterated. All Might's face was covered with soot too. He opened his mouth. "Boy, you were dead," he whispered, eyes wide. "I felt your heart stop and yet." "Yuna," Izuku blurted out, memory returning to him. "Is Yuna all right?" All Might nodded his head towards Yuna, who was curled up into a ball on the floor, her hair burnt at the tips. She was clutching at her knees, her head tucked in between her legs, trying to make herself as small as possible. When Izuku said her name, she raised her head just a fraction to meet his eyes. "Izuku," she said, her voice quavering. You have a quirk?" "No," Izuku replied automatically. He was a little irritated that she was bringing that up at such a time. Some kids really did have no sense of empathy. "Are you okay though, Yuna-chan?" She looked nauseous. The unburnt parts of her hair had been covered with ash, giving her the impression of incredible age and yet incredible vulnerability at the same time. Yuna looked like she were cowering. "Why are you scared?" Izuku inquired, almost dropping his voice to a whisper. "Aren't the villains gone?" Izuku felt a broad hand rest on the small of his back. "She's scared of you," All Might murmured. "She's scared of you, Izuku." Toshinori racked his brains. This child, who was confirmed to be quirkless, suddenly setting an entire room on fire? Or, even more significant than that, coming back from the verge of death in an instant? As Izuku floundered over his declaration, sputtering cries of "Why would Yuna-chan ever be scared of me, and did I hurt her when I grabbed the villain?" and furious constant apologies like "I'm so sorry, Yuna-chan." Toshinori searched for an acceptable explanation. Quirks sometimes manifested themselves in moments of great distress. It wasn't unheard of for a child, even a late bloomer like Izuku at age 8 or 9, to only gain awareness of his quirk because of the event with the villain. Still, the pure versatility of the quirk, bringing Izuku back from the dead, setting the room on fire, swatting All Might across the room despite the unthinkable difference in their weights, etc., was not normal for any quirk, let alone a late quirk. Late-blooming quirks tended to be less obtrusive and heroic, for lack of a better word, than their early-blooming counterparts. It didn't help that every single component of the quirk screamed one for all. What other quirk could pull that much energy from the environment and apply it in so many ways? Toshinori had mixed their bloods, quite literally infusing his DNA into Izuku's veins, but Toshinori had not willingly transferred one for all to Izuku. He had merely entertained the idea of taking Izuku as a successor, and he hadn't consciously agreed to give him one for all. "Right? You did," his mind's eye whispered, almost as if it were a separate being living in him. "You feel the presence of one for all in him. Stop dancing around the issue, there's no doubt that it now resides within him. No matter whether you accept it or not, you have passed on one for all. You passed it on to Izuku." The application of one for all in long-range attacks and healing was unthinkable, though. Even the past holders of one for all had never thought of such an outlandish tactic. However, it was certainly within the range of possibility. One for all simply stockpiled power, and likely had many more uses than the United States of Smash that Toshinori was accustomed to using. The power that Izuku wielded was uncanny, without inhibitions on the taper or the release of the constant stream of energy that one for all provided. Toshinori predicted he would be both wildly powerful and wildly dangerous, both to himself and to others. Toshinori was terrified. For Izuku, the next few days passed in a blur. Partially because of the overwhelming sensory inputs, being carted to the hospital, being clutched by his mother as she sobbed for him in fear and happiness, being questioned by the police, being ogled by his peers at school, but more importantly, because he literally could not walk without sprinting. Sprinting wasn't even the right word for it. When he put out a foot, he would cover an entire block in an instant. Everything was literally blurred around his vision. Izuku had never cried so much, okay, maybe that was an exaggeration, as this. His inability to walk was indescribably upsetting. I don't get it, Izuku cried between hiccups. His mom rubbed his back sympathetically while Izuku sniffled, back arched in their revolving chair. He hadn't yet gotten so large that she couldn't carry him, so Inko gathered her son into her arms, cooing to him softly. Sweetie, know you're a little old for this talk, but your quirk is the same as anyone else's, Inko murmured to him. It's a muscle and you need to get used to contracting and flexing it. You won't be an expert right away. I'm not expecting to be perfect, Izuku groaned, his mouth pressed onto her dainty blue sweater and words muffled. I just want to be able to walk across a room without, smashing into the wall. Inko hummed in agreement. Yes, we've already had 2 walls repaired, and you haven't had your quirk for even 2 weeks yet? Izuku let out another frustrated Mama, what do I do? All you can do is keep moving forward. You always wanted a quirk, even if you were already the spitting image of a hero before getting one. You'll figure it out somehow, you always do. You're a smart little boy, Izuku. Still wrapped in the warmth of her arms, Izuku felt more tears pricking at the edges of his eyes and willed himself not to cry a 3rd time. After all, he was in training to be a hero now. He still remembered the uncomfortable, slightly odd look on All Might's face that day that seemed like years ago now. Izuku remembered thinking how out of place the look was on a face like All Might's and feeling scared. What is it? He had asked fervently, wanting All Might to smile reassuringly like he always had on the TV. Your quirk? All Might had started, then paused, looking like he wanted to say more but was restraining himself. Don't reveal your quirk to others yet. Give me a few weeks, and I'll come back to help you with it. I just need to make the proper preparations. Izuku had never felt so confused as he did after All Might's broken speech. He knew that there was something the hero wasn't telling him, but he didn't know how to ask. Why would All Might help him with his quirk? All the other children who got quirks always figured them out themselves, so why should All Might help him? When he noticed his mom staring at him, Izuku realized that his palms were beginning to grow very warm. Izuku wrenched himself out of his mother's grasp and waved his hands, now glowing green brightly, frantically. Landing on the floor, Izuku burst into tears. Toshinori wasn't stalling. He just had a lot of loose ends to tie up before he could really, truly reveal to Izuku what he had done. Toshinori wasn't ashamed. Why should he be ashamed when he had just saved the boy's life? You didn't save him, his treacherous consciousness whispered. You prolonged his death a little while longer. With that lack of control, he hadn't left Izuku entirely alone, of course. Constant surveillance from the local police as well as from his school teachers meant that Izuku was protected more securely and completely than any other kid his age. Toshinori just hadn't, talked to Izuku yet. He wasn't stalling. There was so much to think about. While he still had relative control over One for All, how long would that last? Were there heroes and plans in place for the day when he did have to retire from hero work? Who could he entrust with the secret that the child Midoriya Izuku now held, arguably, one of the most powerful quirks in existence? So, in between his formal meetings with higher-ups, Toshinori was, doing hero work as usual. Hero work, for Toshinori, was grueling. All day he was bombarded with requests for assistance. The hard part was determining which calls to respond to. The more menial jobs could be handled by other heroes, and sometimes pinging back and forth between different towns and municipalities was more trouble than it was worth. When Toshinori was summoned to dispose of a villain with a menial bouncing quirk in Shizuoka, he thought that the name sounded familiar, in an ominous way. Still, he figured that it was as good a day as any to patrol that prefecture. The ease with which Toshinori disposed of the villain brought him satisfaction and a little relief. Everything had seemed a little chaotic and out of control, and he was glad he could still reliably find joy in keeping a little part of the world safe. Toshinori handed the dazed villain off to the police who had just arrived. They regarded him with nods and smiles of respect. The victory, the handing off, the smiles, All were so natural and common in Toshinori's life as a hero that for the first time in ages, Toshinori allowed himself to feel happily and blissfully normal. "Help, heroes!" A distant, frightened voice rang out, breaking Toshinori's reverie. He glanced at the police officers, who simply looked at him with resolve. "Meet you there, All Might," one short officer chuckled. Toshinori powered up one for all, disgruntledly noting that it took the merest fraction of a second longer to fill his body, something only he would notice, and leapt, faster than the naked eye could follow, toward the cry for help. Unexpected villainy and unexpected rescues were, too, very normal for Toshinori. Over the years, Toshinori had become excellent at figuring out distances based on calls for help. In a couple bounds, he was, by his calculations, at the very spot that the original voice had called from. Of course, another man could have accused Toshinori of misjudging the distance, for all the lack of resemblance that the situation bore to a rescue. There were no villains, nor any victims, just a ring of odd bystanders, and a central fountain with a hole seared straight through it. The bystanders were muttering, some looking concerned and some looking annoyed. The water from the fountain was rapidly leaking into the square. Toshinori shouldered his way through the crowd and saw a small boy with his knees tucked in sitting at the foot of the fountain. His heart clenched at the boy's recognizable green curls and his tight, defeated stance. He wanted to go to Izuku, but he wasn't ready for the press to see Toshinori acting with the boy yet. Izuku would just become an even bigger target after that was let out. Toshinori cleared his throat. "The heroes and police are here," he announced. "Please feel free to go back to your regular activities. The fountain shall be restored as quickly as possible." His polite request was much closer to a command than a request, and thankfully the crowd seemed to get the message. Most returned to mulling about, with a few stubborn individuals lingering near the carnage. As soon as the immediate attention dissipated, Toshinori rushed over to Izuku, kneeling down next to him. "Are you okay, my boy?" Izuku lifted his head from his knees, displaying wide, hurt, reddened eyes. "All Might," he whispered, sounding a little surprised. "That I'm so sorry." The hero shook his head, frowning. It's not your fault. It's mine." Toshinori began to feel lethargic and quickly put a hand down on the gravel to steady himself. His vision wavered. "Was that? Izuku? Stop using on your quirk," he ordered. Izuku groaned, pulling his legs in tighter to himself. "How?" he asked, voice very small. "I don't know how." Toshinori's heart twisted in sympathy. Izuku had a gentle disposition. Toshinori was having trouble choosing the right words. Ever since Nana, he'd fantasized about exactly who his successor would be and what he would say to prepare them for the life ahead. This was certainly not what he had in mind. "It's like an intuition thing." Izuku scrunched his eyes shut. "Okay, so not the right thing to say. A quirk is like having an extra limb, like an arm or a leg," Toshinori began slowly, not sure how receptive 8-year-olds were to metaphors. "You remember what it was like to not have a quirk, right?" He nodded, and Toshinori's vision continued to darken. Izuku's one for all wasn't just siphoning power out of the environment anymore. It was siphoning power out of people. "Well, now that you have an extra limb, you have to learn how to move it and how to keep it still. You don't think when you kick a ball, right? So you don't think when you use 1F your quirk either. You need to feel it." Izuku frowned, a look of concentration flooding across his features. A beat passed, and then two. Toshinori's vision cleared. In fact, he was swimming in pure power. He felt elated and omnipotent at the same time. Izuku's release must have forced some of the energy back out into the environment, and it had been shoved straight into Toshinori. "All Might," Izuku said, grabbing Toshinori's sleeve with a small hand. "Some woman was talking, but I think I did it." "That was terrifying." "Impressive, Izuku. You got the idea very quickly." "Woman?" Then, Izuku's grip slackened. Alarmed, Toshinori placed a hand on Izuku's back, about to ask if he was okay. A small snore erupted from Izuku's lax form. Toshinori immediately realized he was passed out. How long had he had one for all enabled? Toshinori wondered. Even for an adult, that is petrifying. The raw potential in this one is petrifying. Toshinori sighed and carefully gathered the small child into his arms. Especially when sleeping, Izuku's facial features were exceptionally endearing. Carrying the child was a sneeze away from carrying air itself. His outfit, though a little battered and dusty, was a grade schooler's compact navy uniform. Potential or not, he was still just a child. Toshinori felt an indescribable remorse. "So, let me get this straight," Nedza said, his eyes glittering. The chimera straightened his suit, gaze piercing and calculating. "Please do," Toshinori replied, when the silence got long. When Toshinori had requested an immediate meeting with the principal of Yui, he had expected an appointment to be set 1, 2, even 3 days in the future. He certainly hadn't prepared to receive a call back half an hour later informing him that Nedzu could speak with him right then in a small soundproof office located in a vacant third-story hallway in the school. He'd commented on the expedited process, but the secretary had simply shrugged. "You're the #1 hero and a stellar Yui alumnus. How could you not expect this?" So Toshinori had scooped a still-sleeping Izuku up from the spare bed in his apartment. Toshinori had regrettably not had time to figure out where Izuku lived before he collapsed, and so he had, for lack of a better alternative, simply taken him to his own home, jetted over to Yui, planted Izuku in the loving care of a shocked-looking recovery girl, and marched into Nedzu's meeting. He had long lost track of the number of confused stares he'd earned throughout the whole process. "All might, Toshinori-san," Nedzu began. "Your quirk is one for all, and it has been passed along from hero to hero for several generations. You had just recently started turning over the idea of finding a successor in your head, since it takes a while to prepare their body and mind to receive your quirk. Approximately 2 weeks ago, in response to a tip you'd received about a wanted villain's attack, you attended a primary school recital and soon became acquainted with young quirkless Midoriya Izuku. Impressed by his kindness, wit, and talent, you considered him a possible future bearer of One for All. However, the recital was attacked by an army of villains, who you fought back valiantly. But while they distracted you with brute numbers, they captured and abducted a young girl who they claimed to have seen in the future. Ironically, their ally with the future vision. Quirk might have mistook the girl for Izuku himself. Amazingly, Izuku apprehended the villain who was holding the girl captive, cleverly finding a weak point in the evildoer's invisibility quirk. But Izuku was mortally injured by the villain. In your emotion and attachment to Izuku, and your belief that he was an adequate candidate for One for All, you accidentally transferred One for All to Izuku through the mixing of your bloods. One for All probably stockpiled enough energy from the environment to bolster young Izuku's health and bring him back from the verge of death. But Izuku's underdeveloped body, only 8 years of age, wasn't prepared to receive the quirk and released large quantities of energy. You've avoided contact with him for 2 weeks, partially to avoid drawing unnecessary attention to him and partially to collect your thoughts on how to proceed with his education. But ever since then, his quirk has been acting unpredictably and wreaking a considerable degree of havoc on the community. Toshinori released a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "Yes, that sounds about right," he said weakly. Nedzu folded his hands in his lap. "Have you considered having Izuku transfer One for All back to you?" That gave Toshinori pause. "I hadn't really. That's quite unheard of, since One for All is a quirk that binds itself to the soul of the wielder. Even if I did, I imagine it would continue to reach out and yearn for Izuku's spirit too." "Well, you should consider the possibility." Toshinori sighed. It was good advice. "But, getting to the point, Toshinori-san, what's the real reason you asked for this meeting with me?" Nedzu's voice dropped a little in pitch, and the principal leaned forward in his seat. "I imagine you haven't told many other people your well-guarded secret. It would cause ripples, even empower villains who saw your transferable quirk as a possible CHK in your godlike facade. And I hope to God you haven't told another living soul that Izuku is involved with that same quirk." Toshinori breathed. "I haven't, but for his sake more than your own. If that child..." Nedzu seemed to be battling with himself. Maybe he was trying to soften a blow. "If Izuku doesn't destroy himself, I'll be surprised." If he isn't destroyed by droves of villains who see it as the only chance they'll get to nip a symbol of peace in the bud, well, it'll be nothing short of a miracle. Nezu finished ominously. A chill ran down Toshinori's spine. But anyways, why me, Toshinori-san? Why you? Not that I don't consider the information valuable and interesting. To be honest with you, I don't know who else to trust, Toshinori sighed. As my alma mater, I have faith in the ability of Yui to train young heroes. Maybe there are other institutions, but none I can entrust with this secret wholeheartedly, without worrying about behind the table affiliations and trickery. I personally have no experience teaching, and my first attempt to instruct Izuku in the use of his quirk was rocky at best. Nezu, I need help. Nezu exhaled. Toshinori-san, this is a school for high school students, and Izuku is only 8 years old. There is no way that Izuku will be allowed to apply or enroll, and you know that. I know. I just assumed, well, that there would be some sort of resource or way that Yui could help me to instruct him. Even a room that could contain his destructive habits. Nezu finished for him, looking a little amused despite himself. Toshinori-san, you know that would typically not be appropriate. What would we tell his parents? His school when he is missing from attendance? I simply cannot in good conscience remove a child like that from his normal life to begin training him to be a hero. It is unethical. I've already effectively removed him, Nezu-san, Toshinori murmured, feeling a new wave of regret washing over him. Thinking of Izuku's peaceful sleeping face. After this, there will be no way for him to return to normality. His childhood will be cut short. Nezu seemed to pick up on his remorse. You saved his life, Toshinori-san. And yes, you might have put too much responsibility on his shoulders at too young an age, but Nezu smiled. He's so young, and yet you already speak of him with respect. I get the feeling that he would have definitely received one for all eventually, no matter how it happened. Toshinori-san, I'll make a deal with you. For now, young Izuku must stay enrolled at his local school. If we removed him now to bring him to Yui, he would have to suffer through inevitable gaps in basic arithmetic and reading. However, Toshinori allowed himself to feel hopeful. He'd never felt so confused as what he felt when pondering how best to instruct a young child in quirk handling. Toshinori was really, truly grasping at straws. However, he prompted. However, I will offer him special classes in quirk control and strength training at Yui. After all, there's no safer place for him to learn control of his quirk than at our school. I will sleep easy with that arrangement. We will not push his body farther than is suitable for one as young as he. As for his instructor, well, I have a few in mind. The one that jumps out to me immediately, though, has all the necessary qualities and more. A teaching license, a sense of empathy, especially towards children, and the power to neutralize quirks that run amok or get out of control. The issue is that I haven't yet convinced this candidate to give up a bit of the hero life to work at Yui. So you'll have to convince him to come yourself. Toshinori grimaced. Who could that be? He muttered, partially to himself. Nezu's eyes shone in excitement and grim delight. Why, none other than the Erasure hero, Aizawa Shoyuta. When Toshinori got back to the clinic room where he had hastily left Izuku in Recovery Girl's care, Izuku's bed was empty, and Recovery Girl was nowhere to be found. Panic flooded Toshinori's body. Villains? He thought, mind racing. In Yui? The most secure school in the nation? He had failed Izuku, again. And with absolutely no way to figure out where the boy had gone, or who had taken him and Recovery Girl. The worst thing was that this time he wouldn't get the chance to fix his mistake. Idiot. Careless. Number one hero my butt, you can't even protect an 8-year-old. Toshinori's mind continued to conspire against him, pelting him with every self-deprecating word that he knew. He ran over to the door, planning to wrench it open, march to Nezu and demand to see the security tapes, when a peal of laughter sounded from an adjacent room, and a bit of hope bloomed in Toshinori's chest. Gingerly, he walked over to the slightly ajar door connecting the two sick rooms. Peering into the room, he saw a very unusual scenario. A young girl with silky pinkish hair sat upright in one of the clinic beds. A wide bandage covered up most of her forehead, and one of her eyes was lightly bruised. Recovery Girl knelt in front of the girl, holding one of her legs firmly and inspecting one of her knees, which appeared to be scraped up badly. And behind the girl was Izuku, standing up with his arms raised. With a look of concentration on his face and his tongue sticking out of the corner of his mouth, he appeared to be braiding the girl's hair. "You're so gentle, Izuku-an," the pink-haired girl hummed delightedly. "Where did you learn how to braid like that?" Izuku's face reddened slightly, but he persisted in weaving the girl's hair into its intricate design. I like to read books about being a hero. I love heroes." Izuku paused, distracted again by his braiding work. One of the books said tying rope was a really useful skill for heroes to have to get out of bad situations. I read up about knots, and well, I ended up learning how to braid too. I love braiding my mom's hair, also. The girl beamed. "That's so sweet. And you must be really clever to read so much, Izuku-kun." "How adorable." Recovery Girl made a noise of agreement. "You're a child of many talents, Izuku. It's nice to have an assistant in my clinic for once." "Ooh, is Izuku your grandson, Recovery Girl?" the girl asked and then coughed, probably thinking she sounded rude. "Or your son," she corrected. "No," Recovery Girl replied, clicking her tongue. "I believe he's his." Recovery Girl removed a hand from the knee she was inspecting and pointed toward Toshinori at the door. A small, somewhat devious smile was playing on her lips. What? W-ish. The girl stopped, eyes widening like saucers. "That's All Might? What are you doing? So this is All Might's." "All Might!" Izuku cried. With one deft motion, he tied off the girl's hair and leapt off the bed faster than the eye could follow. In an instant, he slammed into All Might's knees like a bowling ball, trapping him in an extremely tight embrace. In front of them, the girl hissed. "He's fast," she whispered in awe. "All Might." Izuku sobbed again. I was scared. I thought you left me." "Not that Recovery Girl and Rina Onizen aren't awesome, but..." Toshinori bent down to pat the boy's head, feeling awkward with the gaze of Rina and Recovery Girl boring into him. "That's..." Rina gasped. "That's so adorable," she exclaimed, practically in tears herself. Toshinori blanched. "And no," Toshinori sputtered. "He's not. I mean, you mustn't tell anyone Izuku is involved with me. It's imperative that..." Rina's eyes, if possible, widened either further. "So he's illegitimate?" Trailing off, she nodded determinedly. Of course, I understand. All Might, anything for my idol. I just mean, that's so cute. You shouldn't be ashamed just because..." "No. It's not like that, young girl. Anyways, I need to take Izuku back home to his mother, so I must depart. I wish you a speedy recovery." "It's okay, All Might," Rina nodded solemnly. "I understand adult matters like that. I'll drop it. I can tell you're uncomfortable. No wonder Izuku is such a comforting and kind presence, though he takes after you. Can't I introduce Izuku to my friends? They would love him." Izuku looked up at him with shining eyes. "I like Rina Onizen," he exclaimed happily. Izuku finally released Toshinori's knees from his death grip and sped back over to Rina's bed. Izuku took a small hand mirror off of the desk and presented it to Rina, who admired her new plaited hair with a pleased look. "Izuku-kun, you're amazing. I love it." She effortlessly picked up Izuku and lifted him in the air. Izuku's legs kicked and he squealed in delight as Rina embraced him tightly and then paused, looking to All Might as if for permission. He nodded slightly, and as she returned her gaze to Izuku, her eyes were filled with admiration and wonder. Toshinori averted his eyes, not knowing what to say anymore. "Anything I say will sound like a futile denial of an illegitimate child," he thought in exasperation and embarrassment, face still pink. "But at least she won't tell anyone about Izuku's power or our affiliation, so I guess it's okay. Unfortunately, young lady, I really must return Izuku to his mother now. She'll think I kidnapped him." Both Recovery Girl and Rina erupted into a knowing laughter. Toshinori's face began to burn again. "No, not like," he began uselessly. "It's okay, All Might," Recovery Girl snickered. "Take Izuku. But promise you'll bring him back to me one of these days." Yeah. Rina piped up. Like I said, my friends would want to squeeze him and never let him go, just like me. Plus, they'll all want their hair braided too. Are we going now, All Might? Izuku said, suddenly at All Might's side. Even All Might was surprised by his strange speed. Maybe, since he was 10 times lighter than All Might, he moved 5 times as fast. Toshinori supposed he should brush up on his kinematics. Yes, my boy, we must, Toshinori said, and then Izuku reached his arms out, looking at Toshinori with totally earnest, owlish eyes. Pick me up, his eyes asked. Toshinori cleared his throat. Izuku was clearly capable of walking. He seemed like he was almost capable of teleporting, the way he moved. There was really no reason for Toshinori to carry him out like he had carried him in. But how am I supposed to say no to those eyes? Toshinori thought, not without a little mirth. Ignoring the adoring us of the two in the room in front of them, Toshinori picked Izuku up effortlessly and hoisted him onto his shoulders. Izuku giggled again in delight, and the two exited the room. Toshinori was trying very hard to keep any fondness off of his face as he finally took the child back home. Inko was no stranger to hardship. Even after her husband ran away and left her to raise their son all on her own, she hadn't complained even once. She'd become an expert at couponing and a master at balancing a billion things at once. Being responsible for house upkeep, meal preparation, work, and mothering all at the same time was no easy task. But when the news report proclaimed the mysterious destruction of a fountain just a few blocks away and her son disappeared without a trace, she could safely say, yes, today has been the hardest and most horrible day of my life. She had called the police, who filed a missing persons report and asked that she give them a few hours. The man had told her not to panic, that sometimes children disappeared for a little while and turned up a few hours later. That she shouldn't start to worry until the next day. That was what spelled trouble. It infuriated her. Inko had paced the room for hours on end, neglecting her usual duties of cleaning and cooking. She had turned over the things her son had said to her before going out that morning. Nothing indicated that he was unhappy or that he planned to run away. Izuku was not the type of child to simply disappear and not tell her anything, because Izuku was kind, and Izuku wouldn't want to hurt her. For the first time in a long time, Inko wished that her quirk were stronger or more useful. Then, she might have the power to go out and save her son all on her own. The police were supposed to help her, not dismiss her concerns. Just when she thought to herself, police or no police, I'm going out to find him and not coming back until I do, All Might himself knocked on their door with Izuku riding on his shoulders like they were father and son. And Inko wondered, has anyone ever slapped the #1 hero before? So did. Inko-san, I am so sorry, Toshinori said, for what had to be the millionth time that night. It's okay, Inko replied, for what had to be the millionth time that night. I'm sorry I slapped you. I was so worried, but I didn't know what had happened. Thank you for taking care of my son. Izuku had been put to bed half an hour ago, and the two of them sat alone in the dim light of Inko's living room. Inko had set out crackers and juice for Toshinori, and he supposed with a little amusement that the two of them didn't entertain many visitors. She was really only prepared to cater to Izuku. Toshinori rubbed the back of his neck sheepishly. It was nothing. It's a little more complicated than that. Inko-san, Toshinori held his breath, mulling over how best to say what he needed to say. He never was the best at this sort of thing. I must talk to you. Inko picked at her fingernails nervously, suddenly looking awkward like she had remembered who she was talking to. What about? She said suspiciously. Izuku's situation. Your son's quirk. He was a late bloomer, Inko replied automatically. Sure, he struggles a little with control, but he only developed the quirk too. That's what I need to talk to you about, Inko-san, Toshinori interrupted, looking a little pained. Let me start from the beginning. So Toshinori did, detailing the incidents at the school recital, Izuku's near-death experience, the transfer of One for All to the child accidentally, the kid's miraculous resurrection, and the true nature of his quirk outbursts. In just a single day, the number of living people who knew Toshinori's secret had increased from 0 to 2. He knew it was dangerous, But Toshinori felt that the only way to truly win Inko's trust was to be completely honest with her. Inko seemed like the type of woman who could smell dishonesty on a person's breath, and Toshinori needed her wholehearted support if he was going to prepare Izuku. Inko was quiet for a long time after Toshinori finished. "I'm sorry," Toshinori whispered, and it was genuine. "I didn't mean to take Izuku's childhood away, it was incredibly hers." "Thank you," Inko breathed. "Thank you for saving his life. I never knew." "But you saved his life and you put him in a lot of danger. I get that. But also, he's always dreamed about a hero, and deep down I knew he should be one, you know? He's just got that compassion, that selflessness, that drive. I know he's only 8, but I could just tell. And I'm scared. I'm terrified, in fact. But you saved him." Her eyes glistened with tears. "And you're going to protect him, aren't you?" "Yes, I will," Toshinori said. "I promise to you that I will with my life. You know, sometimes TV personas are fake and made up. That's what I always worried about. Since Izuku loves heroes so much, I worried that he was actually too pure to be a hero. But you seem just like you did on TV, honest and reliable. I trust you. I trust you to care for my son." Toshinori took in a sharp breath. Even though she said that, he was still fighting against an ultimatum. What had Nezu said? "If Izuku doesn't destroy himself, I'll be surprised. If he isn't destroyed by droves of villains who see it as the only chance they'll get to nip a symbol of peace in the bud, it'll be nothing short of a miracle." It wasn't the first time that Toshinori had to bank on miracles, and it wouldn't be the last. It was exponentially harder to get a hold of Aizawa Shoyuta than it had been to arrange a meeting with Nezu. Maybe because he was an underground hero, maybe because he was barraged with constant mission undertakings, or maybe just because he was notorious for being antisocial. In any case, after the meeting with Nezu, Toshinori pushed all the resources and assistance he had towards seeking out the silent, slippery hero. In the meantime, Toshinori got to know Izuku. Izuku was quiet at first, probably contemplating the similarities and discrepancies between the idyllic All Might that he had observed on TV and the All Might who had let him ride on his shoulders around the block. Luckily for Toshinori, kids his age didn't take long to adapt, and didn't have many reservations around new faces. Izuku was a little shyer than most, but it wasn't long before he began to talk freely. And Izuku talked a lot. At first it was mindless things, like which heroes he thought were the best and what he wanted his hero costume to look like and what his favorites foods were. Then he started talking about hero and quirk theory, and Toshinori was frankly scared. He'd lost track of how many times the child had scared him in the past week alone. Izuku's knowledge of heroes and their quirks, the most ideal and the most detrimental quirk partnerships and battles, the physics behind the workings of most common quirks, and the possible strategical enhancements of said quirks, was extensive for any pro-hero and unbelievable for a child of his age. At some point in one of their conversations, Toshinori had looked around, blindly looking for an adult. His mind rejected his attempt to reconcile the casual display of intense quirk knowledge with the kid whose head only came up to his knees and who'd cried over spilling his lemonade the other day. It couldn't be Izuku saying such weirdly sophisticated things. Toshinori began to wonder whether the child did anything outside of studying heroics. Then, he remembered the child performing a soulful oboe solo just a month ago and concluded that maybe Izuku was just a prodigy. Or, perhaps, quirklessness simply had allowed him more time to hone his mind and spirit than his physical body. On top of all that, Izuku seemed to effortlessly accept that there was something NTMT that connected him and All Might. Maybe he, too, subconsciously felt the presence of one for all in Toshinori. Toshinori had, on multiple occasions, tried to explain that he had actually transferred his quirk to Izuku, but Izuku had just continued on with whatever he was talking about before. Honestly, Toshinori wasn't sure if that meant I already knew or I really don't get it, but okay. Toshinori caught on quickly to the fact that Izuku was not popular in the slightest at his school. The policeman he had watching Izuku at school reported that he rushed out as soon as the bell rang with his head down, and the sentries had, on more than one occasion, seen Izuku crying after interacting with other groups of children. More than anything, they'd seen Izuku hanging around a kid with spiky blonde hair, but their interactions hadn't seemed any kinder than any of the other children's. The police hadn't witnessed actual violence yet, but Toshinori wouldn't be surprised if they did. And as much as Toshinori wanted to intervene, doing so would just put another target on the boy's back. It didn't matter, though. Soon enough, the boy would have exponentially more strength than his peers. If his mental talent didn't impress them into respect and admiration, his physical talent inevitably would. Until then, Izuku would have to deal with his peers' ostracization and insults. Remembering his own childhood, Toshinori knew that sort of treatment wasn't uncommon for the quirkless. When Toshinori tried to talk to him about school life, Izuku hastily reassured him that everything was alright, and Toshinori got the feeling that the response was practiced from his interactions with his mother. On his hefty mental list of Izuku's most admirable heroic traits, he wrote, "Prioritizes the feelings of others over his own." Toshinori wouldn't ever say that giving one for all to a grade schooler was a good thing, but Nedzu was right. He could have done much, much worse. "All Might, why am I skipping school again?" Izuku asked innocently, bouncing alongside Toshinori as he strode swiftly down the street. Toshinori cringed. "Ah, when you say it like that, I sound like a bad influence," Toshinori muttered. "We're going to meet your new tutor." Izuku brightened. "A tutor? Why am I getting a tutor? Am I getting remedial classes?" He sounded out the word remedial carefully, like he'd been practicing it. Toshinori chuckled. "No, it's just because you keep destroying public property, Izuku," he chided, but couldn't muster up any true sternness. "But we have to convince him to tutor you. So be on your best behavior." Izuku puffed his chest out confidently. "Of course. I'm always well behaved." Debatable. Granted, Toshinori wasn't totally sure that Aizawa would show up. He'd received a piece of intel that Eraserhead was pursuing a villain in the area. That was it. After a few weeks with absolutely no response from Eraserhead, and this being the only information he'd gotten about his whereabouts, Toshinori had abandoned the delusion of setting up a peaceful appointment with Aizawa and settled for informally approaching him. It was a little weird, but Toshinori was desperate. One for All acted up several times a day, and the damage was as unique as it was potent, setting fires, creating seismic waves, propelling Izuku up several miles into the air, creating meteorish craters in the ground, etc. Sure, they were all loosely connected by the convention that Izuku was just collecting an ungodly amount of power from the environment and letting it loose, but that was the only similarity between the outbursts. Since Toshinori hadn't spent very much time with Nana and especially hadn't trained very much with her, he'd had no idea that One for All could express itself so differently between two successive holders. Unfortunately, Toshinori got the feeling that Izuku accidentally burning Aizawa eyebrows off would not be the best first impression. After a while of walking in relative silence, Izuku seemed to be getting restless. All Might," he said, voice small. "Where are we going?" "Because I'm getting tear." "Sure," Toshinori murmured suddenly. Izuku obeyed without another word. Finally, Toshinori could make out the faintest of voices, very close by. One voice accusatory, the other resigned and bored. He made a motion with his hand. "In there," he reported, pointing at an innocent, normal-looking, bland house. "Eraserhead is in there. We'll wait outside until—" Izuku was gone, and in his wake was a sea of green sparks. "Damn it," Toshinori swore. "Why are children so impatient?" He ran in the door after Izuku, hoping Eraserhead wouldn't mistake the boy for villain reinforcements. It was unlikely, but he didn't know the true nature of the hero known for taking the dirtiest jobs. "But Eraserhead-san," Izuku was saying, voice sounding strangely airy. "Isn't that a hero? Didn't know that heroes can do evil too?" "Well, nobody talks about that sort of thing, anyway," Aizawa drawled. He was standing in front of a man wrapped in white bandages, who was glaring daggers with his eyes but had his mouth wrapped shut. "Listen, kid, I don't know who you are, but you're interrupting my work. Run back to the playground for now." "Eraserhead," Toshinori greeted. "I'm sorry about him. He got curious and ran in." "All Might?" Aizawa questioned, a little bit of surprise flashing in his eyes before they returned to tired slits. What's all this about? I'd like to talk to you after this, if that's all right. Of course, I understand that you need to, he gestured to the apprehended man, finish your job first. Aizawa nodded. As long as you understand. Come on, Izuku, Toshinori beckoned. Izuku seemed to forcefully tear his eyes away from the wrapped-up man, and obediently followed all might out. After a while, as they stood outside, Toshinori said, I told you to be on your best behavior. I'm sorry. Izuku blurted out, looking genuinely apologetic. I just got so excited to meet the tutor guy, since you were talking about him, and… Toshinori sighed. He realized internally that it probably wasn't a fault of Izuku's. Any child would have probably reacted with the same curiosity and lack of control. But why was he hurting a hero? Sometimes heroes do bad things. Eraserhead is the only one who will take those sort of jobs. Arresting fellow heroes is hard sometimes, but it's necessary, he said. No one is above the law. Izuku nodded solemnly, looking thoughtful. That's really cool. Eraserhead-san is really amazing, he declared. Toshinori laughed. Izuku wasn't hard to impress. Thanks, kid, a voice replied, sounding slightly sarcastic. That was fast, Eraserhead, Toshinori praised, looking at the hero leaning against the wall with his chin tipped up into the air. He had the demeanor and flippancy of one who was fairly young, despite his world-weary expression. Toshinori supposed he was in his early 20s. Maybe that would make it easier for him to connect with Izuku. Aizawa shrugged. I just had to discreetly hand him over to the association, and the local department isn't very far from here, he said blandly. Not that I'm not flattered by your attention, All Might, but what is it? I have a couple other jobs today. Aizawa stared expressionlessly at Toshinori, who laughed as the slight boy sprung into the air with an unnatural buoyancy. Izuku mounted Toshinori's back and rested his chin on the pro-hero's shoulder, gazing down at Aizawa with wide emerald eyes. Toshinori cleared his throat, looking back towards the expectant Aizawa. He could sense that there was nobody in the general vicinity. Luckily for him and what he needed to say, Aizawa had either chosen his time of attack carefully or pulled some strings to rid the area of witnesses. What, Eraserhead, since you're a busy man, I'll cut to the chase. I'll assume that you've been briefed, as was my request from the Hero Association. The look on Aizawa's face implied that no, he had not been briefed. Toshinori essayed in another awkward breath and pressed on. I badly need your intervention in this matter, due to my ahem inexperience. This is my new successor, the next symbol of peace, inheritor of one for all, Midoriya Izuku. Based on a recommendation I've received regarding your affinity for teaching, ability to neutralize quirks gone wild, and general intelligence, I would like for you to tutor him. The kid had already lost interest and disappeared down the street in a blur of green light and sparks. Toshinori didn't seem surprised. Aizawa bit his lip contemplatively. Distantly, he watched Izuku valiantly help an older woman carry what looked like triple his weight in groceries. The woman clapped in delight as the small child lifted the bags effortlessly and marched them over to her waiting vehicle. As he loaded the last bag into the car, smoke started rising from his fingers, and the handle on the final plastic bag melted instantly. Izuku yelped, voicing several frantic apologies and scrambling to collect the woman's cans and containers as they rolled across the pavement. The woman simply looked down, still looking generally pleased. Aizawa coughed. How old is he? An awkward silence. Toshinori knew the question would come up, but he wasn't prepared to answer it. Well, he's almost 9, and by almost I mean 8 years and 7 months, but… Aizawa wanted to smack him. Toshinori saw the look on his face. For one so expressionless, it was one of subdued fire. The #1 hero, known for his tolerance and compassion, wanted him to inculcate a child. No, he said curtly. Toshinori started. Pardon? No, Aizawa repeated. I know you're probably not used to being rejected, All Might. I've always had a lot of respect for you as a hero, but I don't agree blindly to the wishes of anyone. Not even you, All Might? I'm not a teacher, nor do I plan to teach for the foreseeable future. However, even in spite of that, This particular request is, for lack of a better word, idiotic. Not to mention cruel and unusual. There's a reason that hero school starts at 14, not 8, he spat with disgust. Then Aizawa paused, looking exhausted and cynical. I respectfully decline. Toshinori gaped as Aizawa, with one odd glance towards Izuku floundering down the street, turned his back on him. He opened his mouth to protest and then closed it. Once again, Toshinori was letting his emotions get the best of him. This is why he always avoided press conferences. In all of his years of heroism, his natural expressiveness and empathy had never truly left him. A boon in some cases, but usually a terrible diplomatic weakness. Eraserhead, he said, voice steady. I wish I had met with you on better terms, and informed you of certain facts beforehand. However, I must beseech you, don't write me off before you hear the full story. There's nothing more for me to hear, All Might, Aizawa replied, voice as slick as oil. My decision is F. There was a blur of green and white and a distinct whoosh as the air surrounding Toshinori visibly contorted. Toshinori realized too late that he should reach out to catch Izuku's shirt. He realized too late that if he didn't stop Izuku now, he would barrel straight into Aizawa, the man they were trying to convince to tutor him. The kid would immobilize Aizawa with his characteristic bone-breaking embrace, and any microscopic chance they had at convincing the Erasure hero to take up the cause would be lost. Toshinori extended a hand with the lightning-quick speed of one for all, and then, before Toshinori could blink, Izuku was cocooned in a mass of white cloth, with his feet dangling several feet above the ground. Toshinori would never not be surprised at just how small Izuku looked. With his body encased like that, his whole silhouette was barely larger than a basketball. Whoa, kid, Eraserhead muttered, and despite his menacing appearance, with matte black hair was floating eerily and eyes tinged red, his voice had an odd quality to it. Was that supposed to be an attack? Not exactly subtle. Eraserhead glanced at Toshinori. Where'd you even get him? Kid's a natural disaster. Toshinori shook his head slightly. If only he knew the literal truth behind his words. I was just trying to explain that to you, he reminded Aizawa. Izuku started mumbling pitifully. Izuku's head was the only thing poking out of the white restraints, and even Toshinori couldn't help but grimace at the boy's state. His eyes, large enough to cover most of his face, were wide and watery, and his mouth had been left slightly ajar, as if he was still shocked by whose body he had been ramming towards. And no, Izuku whispered. I was walking over, Toshinori finished for him. Walking over, and that happened. What a mess. Aizawa flinched, and the spell were broken. In an instant, he lowered Izuku to the ground and fixed his eyes on the patchy ground. The hero's unsettling quirk seemed to retreat. His bloody eyes faded to a dull black and levitating hair fell back onto his shoulders. Toshinori supposed that Aizawa's slight grimace was the closest the man came to expressing shame. He doesn't like using his quirk on children, Toshinori guessed. He doesn't understand that Izuku's mumbling was all, not fear. Still, for one with such a unique and potent ability, it's good that Eraserhead is not a villain. That was so cool. I can't believe you're going to tutor me. Thank you. Izuku exclaimed happily, beaming at Aizawa. The older man looked disgruntled. How does your quirk work? It was like, for a moment, my body was super light and I could feel that there was nothing. It was like it was before, but it felt so weird, and your eyes changed color? Is that how it works? You have to stare at them? Then how? Izuku dissolved into quiet murmuring, talking to himself instead of Aizawa. More than once, Toshinori thought he saw Aizawa flinch when the words cool, and awesome, and useful popped into the dialogue. Still, Toshinori silently applauded Izuku for figuring out even a couple of the conditions of Eraserhead's quirk with just one display. Maybe that would be enough for Eraserhead to seriously consider taking up his proposal. But Aizawa simply brushed Izuku off. I'm not tutoring you, kid, he sighed. Aizawa glanced at his watch and rolled his shoulders, a clear dismissal. Izuku's mumbling stopped abruptly, and his eyes glistened once again. The shift in his mood crashed through the air like a shockwave, and Toshinori felt incredibly uneasy. Another latent effect of One for All? WWI, though? Izuku sputtered. Toshinori scrounged up a bit of hope. After all, Izuku's powers of childlike endearment were nothing to sneeze at, and it wasn't unthinkable that they would work on Aizawa too. But, to his horror, it was the opposite. Aizawa stiffened for a while, peering down at Izuku like he was some disgusting creature he'd accidentally stepped on in a parking lot. Then, he closed his eyes and muttered some sort of curse under his breath. "Kid," he glowered, "didn't you say you wanted to be a hero? What kind of attitude is that for a hero?" Izuku froze, eyes widening infinitesimally. Children were so malleable, so receptive to opinion. The child seemed to retreat in on himself, his expression filled with deliberation. "You're right," Izuku said solemnly, lowering his head slightly. "Heroes should be strong." And just like that, the situation was defused. The slender, shadowy hero paused once more to look at Izuku. His gaze was filled with something unreadable. Toshinori couldn't help but wonder what was going on in his head. Curiosity? Disgust? Interest? Revulsion? Toshinori took the opportunity to quickly step forward and press a small white card into Aizawa's palm. Aizawa regarded it with tired disinterest but pocketed it politely. "Eraserhead," he murmured as Aizawa stared past him in boredom. An image of Aizawa gently lowering Izuku to the ground was replaying in Toshinori's head. "My source was not wrong. You seem good with children." Aizawa shrugged. "He reminds me of someone I used to know," was his only response. Then, as lithely as a cat, Eraserhead slunk away, and Toshinori and Izuku were left alone with nothing to show for their efforts. School for Izuku had continued as usual in that he always kissed his mother goodbye, hurried over to school with his head ducked, and wordlessly began to do the work his teachers asked. Like always, he would look away from the sneers of students and teachers alike, pen pressed to paper, head as far down as it would go. It had been a while since he even bothered to talk in class, knowing that it would end in laughs and jeers. The only thing that was different now, with a quirk, was that instead of hanging around, wondering if Kaken would let him stay around, he often rushed straight home with journal clutched tightly in hand. Today was one of those days, and he was eager to write down something he'd seen in a news ad regarding Watergun's quirk. Well down the path home, he allowed his mind to wander. Izuku had dreamed about getting his quirk since he was old enough to pronounce the word. Izuku had wondered what kind of quirk he would get. Maybe he would get a summoning quirk like his mom, or a fire quirk like his dad, or maybe something exciting and entirely different. The child had once pondered whether the schoolyard children would stop picking on him once he had a quirk. Privately, he fantasized about more than a simple ceasefire. Maybe the kids could even respect him, like they respected Kaken, once he got a quirk. After several years, though, the dream had begun to fade. Every birthday he celebrated was a reminder that he was quirkless and useless after all. Izuku had almost forgotten how it felt to wish for his quirk's magical, delayed appearance. In some ways, his steadily decreasing hope was a blessing. At least he was less disappointed, but mostly, it was just a cruel reminder of how hope could die. So now that he had gotten his quirk yet had been instructed fiercely not to reveal the details or potency of said quirk, his fading dream had reared its ugly head. Izuku was scared of it. After being bullied for so long, he'd come to realize that fear never really had one sole culprit. It was always a combination of various things, some obvious and some unclear, that all got mixed and mashed together to terrify someone. That had never been truer for Izuku than it was now. He was terrified of his classmates' reactions to him and his new power, but terrified of opposite yet equally awful outcomes. If he revealed his quirk to his classmates then, how would they react? They might think it was a stupid and weak quirk and still bully him. They might say that he couldn't control it anyway, so he might as well be quirkless after all. They might not even believe him that he had a quirk at first, if he couldn't prove to them that his speed and strength and stamina were anything but the result of intense practice. Maybe they'd be too used to hating him to ever think of him as an equal. Maybe, Izuku thought, they might even hate him more, thinking he was some miraculous sort of quirkless quirk-holding imposter. The only thing scarier to Izuku than nothing changing was their treatment of him getting worse. On the other hand, what if his quirk wasn't permanent? What if Izuku never even got the chance to show his classmates his quirk? Izuku knew the thought was silly. No one, not even criminals, ever truly lost their quirks. Sure, there were quirk-suppressing drags and relaxants, but those were temporary. People only ever lost their quirks if they got chopped up into pieces or died. But Izuku was different. His quirk had come into his life so suddenly. It was a power that popped into existence as easily as a gust of wind and spun him around like a worthless toy. So, Izuku couldn't help but be nervous that it would pop out of existence in the next instant. After all, his quirk was alive. Izuku wondered about his quirk. When it came to anyone else, he could figure out their quirk in all its workings, its weaknesses, its strengths. It was one of the few things that ever made him happy at times when everyone was against him. But his own quirk seemed like an enigma, even to him. But he couldn't complain, could he? This was what he'd wished for the past 4 years. And yet, his power seemed more suited for destruction than heroism. Absent-mindedly, Izuku rummaged for the presence of his quirk deep in his stomach and felt the power emerge and pool under his skin. His arm hair stood up on end. Hot but cold, scathing but bitter. It almost hurt him just to summon the quirk, just to sense it was there. He'd certainly gotten a knack for feeling it, but the second it was pulled out him. "Oi, Deku," a voice snarled. Izuku winced. It was only recently that Kaken had learned how to twist his voice into a snarl that mean. "Kaken," Izuku replied meekly. He had been walking down the path from their school. Izuku's hands were still twisted into the old fabric of his school shirt. He'd been lost in his thought and hadn't even noticed the blonde approaching him from behind. How are you?" Kaken growled again. "Don't ask me how I am. That's not how this works. Why the hell are you stopped here, dumbass?" "Kaken. Swearing is what? I'll swear all I like, dumbass. Just because the teachers nail me for it doesn't mean anything. We're not in class." The last sentence trailed off into the air, hanging ominously over them. "We're not in class." Izuku was well aware of that fact. An overly warm hand clapped him on the back, not hard enough to be a strike, but with enough force to make Izuku wince. Claw-like fingernails pressed one by one into his neck. It was only recently that Kaken had become so comfortable with hurting Izuku. Lost again, stupid Deku? Or just lost in your thoughts? Izuku's vision swam. He knew he'd been stopped on the path home for a few minutes, at least, but how could Kaken think he had gotten lost? He took the same route home, day after day, just like Kaken did. "I was just thinking," Izuku mumbled, biting his lip. "You always think too much," Kaken exclaimed with a grunt, pressing harder on his back so that Izuku shifted forward, his spine arching under the pressure. Izuku had to shift and clench his jaw. It was hard enough to try not to use his quirk on a regular basis. With this kind of pressure, Izuku had to stay completely still just not to shoot 3 miles forward. It was very hard not to tense his muscles when Kaken was breathing down his neck. "Please don't, Kaken," Izuku said, but he knew that his plea was different from any pleas before it, because this time, he wasn't thinking, "Please don't hurt me." He was thinking, "Please don't let me go. Please let me keep control." Kaken didn't, unfortunately, see the difference in him. If anything, the blonde boy was encouraged by the familiarity of his fear. "As if," he laughed. "Why, Kaken?" Izuku whispered, voice cracking. He'd only said why, but it could have been completed by a number of follow-up questions. "Why are you hurting me? Why have you become so cruel? Why can I never talk you out of it? Why did All Might tell me not to show you my quirk? If only I could show you my power," Izuku thought. "If only you knew I could be normal, then you wouldn't be hurting me." Was that true? Izuku knew, deep down, that the point of his quirk wasn't for showing off, but he didn't just want to show off. He wanted to survive. Still, he kept completely still and didn't allow himself to twitch even a muscle. If he was anything other than relaxed, his quirk would most definitely activate, and Kaken would scream and hate him, and All Might would be disappointed in him. Kaken kept digging into his back, hurling insults at him. "Dumb Deku! Can't you even respond to me?" he demanded. There weren't many people on the path, but the ones that did wander past them averted their eyes. Izuku was well known to be quirkless and useless, And Kaken was established as powerful and promising. The roughhousing was, in an awful sense, expected. Izuku wanted to survive, and he wanted Kaken to survive too. Still, he trusted All Might. There must have been a reason for him to tell Izuku to keep it a secret. Eyes watering, he kept his limbs completely still, even as his back ached and screamed under Kaken's grip. Won't you even move? Listen to me, I'm the powerful one, you're the weak one. You have to listen to me, idiot. The little light came on in Izuku's head. At least, that was what Izuku had taken to calling it. It was too much to call it a voice or a group of voices, even. The feeling was on the same layer, or maybe a layer above, his own personal consciousness and intuition. The light in his head had arrived, like many other things, with the appearance of his quirk. The only reason he understood that was because the light was too chaotic to be him. He guessed that there were 8 or 9 different opinions warring in that little pocket of his brain. They only ever appeared for a couple seconds at a time, charging him with an emotion, excitement, drive, confusion, curiosity, before vanishing into nothing. And though there were so many of them, there was one that stood out above all the rest, in both clarity and emotion. A woman's voice, and the only voice that had ever actually talked to Izuku. Granted, the woman's voice had only appeared for 20 seconds before vanishing. "Yin, you're pretty tuned in. I guess kids are really susceptible to us," she'd said. Izuku had looked around, searching for the source of the rambunctious voice and finding air. "Whoa there, relax. Relax your whole body. Relax and let one for all rest too." After that incident, Izuku had been subjected to no more disembodied voices, though he'd had his fair share of emotions streaming in from his quirk. The emotions didn't come for very long either, but they were disorienting and distinct. Izuku wondered if everyone experienced something like this with their quirk. The light was conflicted today. The left hand of his brain was dominated by a handful of voices screaming anxiety and apprehension, and the right was swarmed with the rest howling with anger and indignation. The message was clear: either you can run and preserve your secret, or you can confront the boy and realize just how good it feels to hurt someone who has hurt you so much. It made no sense, but his quirk was alive. "I don't want to hurt him," Izuku thought. "Stop," Izuku breathed. The feelings, though confused, abetted at once with his command. Then, Izuku's brain was once again his own. "Huh." Kaken was clearly getting impatient. "What was that, dumb Deku?" Izuku saw it coming, and his mouth formed words. "Stop, no, don't, not for his sake, not to avoid the pain, but because he didn't know what would happen to both of them. I can't control it," he thought desperately, but his mouth prevented the words from coming out. He couldn't betray All Might, and there wasn't enough time to explain anyways. Kaken, with an angry growl and a valiant shove, pushed Izuku onto the ground. For a moment, nothing happened, and Izuku wondered if he were so lucky that his ticking time bomb, out of control, wildly unpredictable quirk had chosen this moment to restrain itself and not counter-react. Izuku felt, for a moment, a rush of unexpected and pleasant hope. Then the ground exploded underneath their feet, and a surge of viridescent power rippled from Izuku's veins and shot out of his arms. Chunks of earth flew up around them and tremors pulsated under their feet. Kaken's body lit up like fireworks, and Izuku felt hot tears stream down his face as his first friend was swallowed in a harsh light show of his own doing. Crime was undeniably getting worse in the city, of that Aizawa had no doubt. He wasn't too worried. In his few years of heroism, he'd seen villainy ebb and flow like the tide. There wasn't always a reason for it, there was only luck and chance. In fact, statisticians had been collecting data on the topic for years and still hadn't found a way to reliably predict when villainy would next spike. It was only that, of the many peaks, this was a particularly massive one. And it wasn't just mainstream heroes that were feeling the heat. Even underground heroes like him were faced with a slowly mounting number of jobs. Which is what makes it even more unusual for All Might, the #1 hero, to choose to tutor a child right now. Even if said child did seem to be shrouded in some sort of oddly powerful aura, have a gleam of decidedly unchildlike intelligence in his eyes, and move faster than All Might himself. Aizawa shook his head. He refused to call it power. Children, in his experience, did not have power, they were kids. He settled for talent. focus, he scolded himself, leaping to the next rooftop. It was truly uncharacteristic of him to let his mind wander from the task at hand, which, for the time being, was stalking his prey. The criminal was quickly apprehended, muted and wrapped in bandages. Her half-lidded eyes were saturated with confusion and fear. Most people were caught off guard by the effect of his quirk, since it was seen as more predisposed to villainy than heroics. He'd always had to press through the doubt and fear of his peers and foes alike. Aizawa turned her over to the police, exchanging a few words with a higher-up officer and then bolting out as quickly as he had arrived. Unlike other heroes, he had never found praise and adoration an effective motivator for heroism. Aizawa hated that he considered himself a good judge of character, else, that child might have not left an impact on him at all. He was slight and skinny, and even though his quirk was obviously powerful, it was also unrefined. Enhancer quirks like that were rare, but not worth the personal interest of All Might. No, it had been something else. Maybe it was his erudite fascination with quirks, or his hurried and earnest attempt to help the old woman, or the clear empathy and understanding in his eyes when he learned of Aizawa's modest rank and underappreciated role in the hero ranking system. Aizawa decided that the boy's eyes were dangerous, after all. The hero paused in an alley. He'd been wandering aimlessly, waiting for his next call, which, judging from the previous few weeks, was minutes away. As if in response, the phone in his pocket vibrated. Sighing, he pulled his goggles up to his forehead and removed his phone. "Haven't heard from you in a while, so I thought I'd check up on you, love." Aizawa scrunched his nose at the emoji. So much for another job. He punched in, with his fingers still awkwardly fumbling over the keys. "What makes you think I wouldn't be okay?" The reply came almost instantaneously. Hizashi obviously didn't struggle with his cellular device like he did. "Am I not allowed to check on a friend?" Sad face. Aizawa expelled a breath. What had possessed him to let Hizashi convince him to buy a phone in the first place? "I'm getting rid of this phone. Shota. I told you, it's easier to keep track of villain attacks this way. Plus, you need a friend like me to make sure you don't get swallowed in your work." It was easier to keep track of his work this way, not that he'd ever admit that to Hizashi. "I'm fine. We're gonna get dinner tonight at Nico's, all right?" Tongue sticking out. But Present Mike ignored his rejection and spammed his phone with the address, time, what he planned to order, what they would talk about, and how excited he was. Aizawa frowned. He doubted Hizashi would take no for an answer at this point. He supposed that as long as the lack of calls persisted, it would be okay to take a brief break. Hizashi was an oddity to Aizawa. Aizawa hadn't been devoid of any friends at graduation, obviously, but shortly into their careers as pro-heroes, most of his peers had just drifted away. Not with any fight from him, of course. Aizawa preferred to be on his own. Of the 20 in his graduating class, most of them had chosen the flashy pro-hero life, and in truth, Aizawa's underground heroism simply wasn't compatible with that. All of his peers probably fought villains together on a regular basis, whereas he adopted an ambush fighting style. His style was a technique developed by loners, not by bright, shining groups of young heroes. The voice hero was another story. Despite their vastly different lifestyles, Hizashi always somehow managed to find Aizawa, force him into some kind of social situation, and act like they were still happy teenagers. In all honesty, Aizawa had half given up on trying to fight it. He flicked a finger across his screen to find the address of the restaurant. "Mediterranean. Not my favorite," he noted, a little amusedly, beginning to walk brusquely down the alley. He'd be able to get there in minutes, but the dinner wasn't for another hour and a half. Aizawa wondered if he'd be able to get in another job before then. It was then that his ears pricked, the wind carrying an odd sound toward him. So faint, he almost couldn't comprehend it. Leaping forward toward the noise, he strained his ears. He had no listening quirk, but his ears had been trained extensively over the years. After a few moments, the noise became unmistakable, a child's crying. Aizawa's hair stood on end as he took to the rooftops once more. Finding the crying child wasn't difficult. Actually, the incident had been only the next street over. Not a street, Aizawa corrected himself. More like a midwoods path. "It isn't paved." Well, it wasn't a street because it wasn't paved, but also because it was half destroyed. Where a path once had been, there was a miscellaneous collection of rocks, rubble, and uprooted plants. The clearing was all but abandoned, thankfully, meaning there couldn't be many victims if it were indeed a villainous attack. Aizawa quickly scanned the terrain for aggressors but found nothing. Not only the path itself, but the foliage and greenery behind it was also empty of life. All but the two children huddled. No, one child was hugging another child, who was splayed out and limp in the middle of the wreckage. Aizawa's heart skipped a beat. Green hair. Puzzle pieces clicked together in Aizawa's mind. He swore internally. It had barely been a week, and yet here he was again. And now that he'd followed the noise, he'd be obligated to help the child even in such a bothersome situation. Soundlessly, he crept over to where the boy was clinging to his injured companion. Approaching them was like swimming through tar, as if power itself coalesced in the space surrounding the children. The boy on the ground was covered in red marks and nicks, and his eyes were closed, but he was noticeably breathing. That was a relief. Aizawa cleared his throat. "Kid," he said uncertainly, reaching out a hand to place it on Midoriya's shoulder. "Don't touch," Izuku hissed, not turning around. "Don't touch you because you're dangerous, or don't touch the other kid because he's hurt?" Aizawa wondered, before he felt his hand get repelled. All of a sudden, he was reaching out toward the air next to Midoriya, rather than toward the child himself. What kind of wacky enhancer quirk does that? Aizawa felt irritation in spite of himself, but then it quickly faded, replaced by an annoying emotion he certainly did not welcome: concern. He activated his own quirk, and as he erased Midoriya's, it was like erasing electricity from the air itself. The knot in his throat, that he'd not been aware of, dissolved. "Too much power. We need to treat your friend," Aizawa stated simply. He saw Midoriya's shoulders slump. Aizawa's breath hitched. It was a depressing sight. Will he be okay?" Izuku whispered, voice breaking. He turned around to look at Aizawa, finally, and his eyes were red and raw. "How am I supposed to know if you won't let me near him?" Aizawa said, not unkindly. After a moment of hesitation, Midoriya got to his knees and turned his shoulders toward Aizawa, not leaving the blonde boy's side but still giving the hero an opening to approach him. Aizawa crouched in front of the hurt kid, checking his vitals swiftly. "His wounds are entirely superficial. Looks like most of the damage was on the environment, luckily," he announced, seeing Midoriya's tight expression soften exponentially. More tears materialized in his wide eyes. "You did this, right?" Midoriya's expression soured again, instantly. He gave a short, detached nod, regret swallowing his face. "I didn't mean it. He pushed me, but I didn't. Obviously, Aizawa dismissed him. "If you'd meant it, you could have probably killed him." Midoriya froze, and squeezed his eyes shut as if he was trying to dismiss the thought. No, I couldn't." "You could, and the sooner you come to terms with that, the better." Tears began to stream from Midoriya's eyes again, and Aizawa gathered the blonde boy into his arms. It wouldn't be a problem to move him, not with these sort of wounds. Still, he paid attention to when the boy's sleeping face shifted in discomfort and adjusted his hold accordingly. Even Aizawa, in his profession, wasn't unused to saving victims. "We'll take him to the hospital now," Aizawa said, looking back at Midoriya. He wiped his eyes hurriedly, setting his jaw in what looked like mock resolve. "And we're calling your parents." He checked his watch. Hizashi would have to settle for a fashionably late meal. Hizashi squinted at the clock on the far wall of the diner, then returned to playing Neon Cat on his phone, still alone. The game's bright colors and sounds were of some comfort to him. Tonight, he'd opted for a more civilian-type outfit, with a bright orange t-shirt and blue jeans, so at least passerbys would pity the random young adult and not the semi-popular hero present mic. It wasn't the first time Shota had been late to dinner, but it was the first time he'd been 45 minutes late. Still, Hizashi preferred excessive tardiness to the alternative, so he stayed at his table, refusing to leave. The guy was often behind because of his allegedly super busy schedule, but he still had never stood Hizashi up. So when he spotted the black-haired man come through the entrance, still in his hero costume, He hummed and clapped in delight before squinting at the boy he was entering with. Shota always moved fast, so they were at Hisashi's table before he had a chance to absorb the new information. "Hey," Aizawa greeted him, folding himself down in a chair. Hisashi stared. "Hiya," he replied automatically, not taking his eyes off the kid. Who's this?" "I didn't have a chance to get rid of him if I was going to get here at a reasonable time," Shota huffed, as if that explained everything. "Present Mike," the tiny green-haired child stuttered. "I'm really sorry to intrude, but, you have such an amazing quirk. Even though it's not offensive by nature, you've made it such a powerful weapon, in addition to being good for communication and intimidation. Since you generate sound waves, I've always sort of wondered if you could propel yourself forward with noise itself. I read that some researchers in Switzerland have figured out how to levitate objects and move them in midair with sound too. I'm a really big fan." His face was glowing red by the end of it, and he forced his moony eyes down to the ground in embarrassment. Hisashi glanced at Shota, who shrugged. "My bad, Midoriya is a hand Shota." Hisashi wailed as he hurtled toward the tiny kid, wrapping him in an embrace. "You never told me you adopted a child. This is so unlike you. And such a cute and keen one. At that, I'm missing out." "I didn't adopt a child," Aizawa said sharply. "Inside voices, you're gonna deafen him. And, Jesus, Hisashi, you're suffocating him. That's unprofessional as well." "I can't help it," Hisashi sniffled. "Well, when a scruffy little kid starts talking like he's studied quirks for 30 years, it's so endearing. You're lucky he tired his quirk out, or he might explode you on contact," Aizawa mumbled. "What was that?" Hisashi asked, curiously, releasing Midoriya from the bear hug. "Nothing," Aizawa replied. "Anyways, Izuku's just with me until I return him to All Might." "So he belongs to All Might?" Hisashi said, eyes widening. "He's a child and doesn't belong to anyone." Izuku's face was still burning when Aizawa motioned for him to take a seat. Hisashi noted that his clothes were a little gray and beaten up, as if he'd been playing with fire or electricity or something. Truly, the kid really was a small thing. Not only was his build slight, but his face still had the characteristic softness and plumpness of adolescence. He couldn't be more than 10 years old. How was he connected to the two heroes? Hisashi abandoned the more serious topics for the time being. It looked like Izuku had experienced quite an exciting day already, and started to make small talk with his best friend. It was his job, after all, to talk about everything, not just heroics. Shota already spent every night tracking down villains and exhausting himself and his quirk. If it weren't for Hisashi, he might never think about actual government politics, or the weather, or the new TV show on Netflix, or anything relating to the real world. At some point, the kid had pulled on Shota's sleeve, and Hisashi had barely overheard. "Are you sure Kaken is okay? Should we go back?" Aizawa had just shaken his head minutely in response. "The doctor told us he'd be just fine, and then dismissed us," the hero muttered back, his mouth barely moving. Hisashi had made a mental note, but then continued with his conversation hopping. "And so, yeah, Taylor Swift is making a comeback, but without all her nice country girl teen appeal," Hisashi finished with a touch of sadness. "I never liked her to begin with," Aizawa answered, pushing a feta-encrusted tomato around his plate. "Do you still do that radio show host thing in your free time?" "That's why I'm used to shitting on Miss Swift," he replied joyfully, then blanched, looking at Izuku. See, I'm sorry, little listener, for the language." Midoriya smiled a little. After ordering Dino nuggets and fries from the kid's menu, he had been mostly quiet during the dinner. The kid had only chimed in to offer the occasional insightful comment, but kept to himself otherwise. Probably, he was just a little awkward intruding upon a conversation between two pros. That's really fine. Most kids at my school know curse words anyways, we just pretend not to, so our parents don't worry," he confided sheepishly. Hisashi nodded solemnly, as if a guarded secret had been passed on to him. "Anyways, how's your day job going, Aizawa? Or lack thereof? Do you do anything but get the villains nowadays?" "I'm a hero," Aizawa said simply, without further explanation. "Even heroes need some kind of reprieve." Come on, Shota. You used to say you wanted to be a teacher, though I get the feeling you just like the control. Aizawa glared at him, and Hizashi giggled in the way he always did when he hit an acceptable nerve. Then the erasure hero deflated. That was then. This is now. But the principal even said you'd be suited for it. Aizawa changed the subject. The conversation lasted for 20 more minutes, with Hizashi jumping on random topic after random topic and Aizawa following along dutifully. Izuku kept quiet. Well, Aizawa finally said, I need to take you home, soon, Midor. The two heroes glanced at Izuku, who was still quiet. Now, though, his eyes were shut and his breathing was slow and regular. The kid had fallen asleep in the chair. Hizashi laughed, more quietly than he himself thought was possible. I guess he was tired, he said with a little affection. He had a long day, Shota confirmed. What is he to you then? Will he be okay? Shota grimaced. He's got the personal tutelage of All Might, and I still can't tell you whether he will be. If that's any indication. Tonight, I found him after he obliterated half a mile of forest and knocked out his bully on accident. He was crying over him. He's got power and no way to control it. Yet you seem to know him. Shota paused, glancing around them and then back at Hizashi as if deciding what to say. Then he shrugged. All Might asked me to tutor him, he admitted, scratching behind his head. I said no. What? Hizashi shrieked, then covered his mouth. They looked at Izuku, his eyelashes fluttered but didn't open. The voice hero lowered his. What? How could you? This boy's a riot. He was pretty quiet. No, I mean, just a dinner with him and I can tell that he's smart and kind beyond his years. And like I said, pretty endearing. Man, I wish All Might had asked me, he teased. Just because he's All Might doesn't mean I have to agree to it. Well, it wouldn't be because he's All Might, it would be because Izuku's Izuku, Hizashi said conspiratorially. What a characteristically roundabout sentence. He watched as Shota felt around for something in his pocket and then stopped. Aizawa stood up from his chair, extending a hand with a roll of bills toward Hizashi. No! Hizashi squealed. You always pay. This is my turn. Shota looked at him blankly. Suit yourself. Thanks for dinner. With one swift, cutting motion, he lifted Midoriya as easily as a grocery bag and carried him out of the restaurant. Hizashi smirked at his retreating form, at the fact that Aizawa tried to act unaffected and detached. Too easy, he cried victoriously, before he noticed something unfamiliar in his hand. Hizashi stared down at his hand, where the same roll of bills Aizawa had extended towards him had been wordlessly planted. Hey! Shota, you son of a beach! Izuku felt wind on his cheeks, the kind of pressure that you feel when you go straight down on a roller coaster, only he was too tired to open his mouth to scream. Then, suddenly, the wind stopped, and was replaced by gentle rocking. It was peaceful, and Izuku's mind took him back to when he was a very small child. He remembered when his mother would rock him back and forth gently, humming lullabies. The last thing he would see before sleep took him was her smile. Izuku opened an eye, glancing up toward the sky. Maybe it was that it was dark out, but he swore he saw black hair. Ach! Mom doesn't have black hair, he thought, before he was pulled back under by the enticement of sleep. In his dream, he was flying, so fast and high that the city underneath him had morphed into a blur of green and gray. He realized happily. So my quirk is flight. He knew that he'd been in this place before, thought the same thought before, but he was still overcome by relief and pride. When the rocking stopped, so did his dream. His body was still heavy with sleep, but he was keenly aware that he was no longer being held. Izuku felt very cold. A faint voice floated into the room, from somewhere to his right. Body was glowing on the way back when he was asleep, the voice deadpanned. I see, a different, deeper voice replied, sounding tired. Was there anything else? You should keep your eyes peeled. There wasn't anyone there when I arrived, but it's highly likely there could have been a witness to his outburst. Of course. Well, in any case, thank you for taking care of him. There was a pause. I was just doing my job, the first voice said grudgingly. I was lucky to have found him. Your quirk is a rare gift, The deep voice agreed, admiration evident. Have you considered my offer? Izuku fell back asleep. When Izuku woke up, the first thing he smelled was his mother. He was surprised by the vividness of the scent. It was like he was standing in the middle of a field of lilacs, and his whole body crumpled with sheer comfort and delight. He blinked blearily, only to find that his mom's face was inches away from his, studying him closely. Her eyes widened when their gazes met. Izuku, you're awake, she said, lip wobbling like she was on the verge of tears. I'm so glad. They told me you weren't injured, but I still worried. Mom, Izuku whispered, more out of surprise than anything else. Injured? What do you mean? What? The previous night came flooding back to him, and he gripped his sheet tightly. Kaken? He said immediately. His voice sounded strange in his own ears. Is Kaken? His mom smiled sadly. Katsuki is fine, sweetie. He's just a little scratched up. Mitsuki said they'll probably release him today. Izuku thought the ceiling might come crashing down on him. So he'll be okay, he breathed, more of a statement than a question. His mom nodded anyways. I'm just glad you're okay, darling. You must have been frightened, she said, peering at him oddly. Izuku noticed that a little tune was playing in the background, light and soft, almost non-existent, but still there. His mom must have pulled out their small stereo, a small form of comfort in such a scary situation. Izuku's heart clenched. He inhaled, then processed what his mother had just said. Frightened? Yes. It's a relief that Aizawa-san got there when he did. I hope they catch the villain soon, she added as an afterthought. Villain? Izuku opened his mouth in protest, then closed it as understanding dawned on him. Did Eraserheads have to lie for me? He knew morality wasn't always black and white, but still, pushing a hero to blatant dishonesty left an awful taste in his mouth. What was even worse was what the pro-hero had to lie about. Surely, if anyone found out about his outburst or his lack of control over his quirk, they would detain him. Or at least send him to therapy. A chill of fear ran down his spine. Inko was still staring at him, waiting for a response. Wordlessly, she held out his arms to him. Izuku recoiled, the image of Kaken's limp body playing behind his eyelids like a silent horror film. He pressed his fingers into his sheets further, unable to meet his mother's eyes. Inko kept silent, but he could feel her eyes boring into him. Izuku squirmed, head still down. His mom asked if he was okay a couple more times, receiving non-committal murmurs in response, and then finally left his room. When she disappeared through his doorframe, so did the comforting smell of lilacs. Izuku scribbled down the free response answer on his history test. He'd absorbed information on the Edo PRD since he was old enough to SCK a pacifier, after all. He slapped the paper down on the teacher's desk, earning a grunt as she was roused from her nap, and scurried back to his desk. Izuku ignored the annoyed glances from his classmates and sunk lower into his seat. He already knew what they were thinking. Loser. Good for nothing. Izuku was too busy thinking about who wasn't there to notice the malicious stares of the kids who were. Glancing at the clock, he tapped his foot impatiently. Just 15 more minutes until freedom. His phone buzzed. Izuku snuck a glance at the teacher, who had returned to her peaceful nap, chin tilted up in the air and chest rising and falling slowly. Then he pulled his phone out of his pocket and flipped it open discreetly. Meet me at the Aldi near your school. Izuku frowned. The number wasn't saved in his contacts, but then again, the only contacts he had saved in his phone were his mom and dad's, the latter of which he hadn't touched in years and probably had been discontinued just as long. By the way, this is all might. Smiling hesitantly, he slipped the phone back into his shorts. Izuku knew from watching and reading so much about heroics that it could have been a trap laid out to fool him, but doubted that anyone would go to the trouble of trapping someone as useless as him. The bell rang and Izuku jumped from his seat, eager to skip the stampede of taller, heavier kids rushing to get out. He rather enjoyed being 3D, so getting flattened wasn't high on his priority list. Most of the kids were still glaring at their tests, so Izuku saw a perfect opportunity to avoid the traffic. But as he made a beeline for the door, he noticed too late the outstretched leg of one girl still sitting down. She smirked at him maliciously, and he threw out his hands in a futile attempt to stop his momentum. Izuku didn't make it in time. But as he closed his eyes and prepared himself for the impact of face-planting into the linoleum and the shrieks of giggles that surely would ensue, time stopped. Or, at the very least, it sure seemed that way. Izuku's eyes flew open, and he was parallel to the tile. Motion completely stopped. He just stared at the tile for a moment, suspended in midair. Floor. As quickly as he could manage, he slammed his feet onto the ground and straightened his back. He turned to the girl whose arrogant face was stricken with shock. She gaped at him. Deku? She asked, and then rubbed her eyes with a furious passion. That's weird. Could have sworn. What are you looking at? Get lost, loser. So Izuku did, fleeing the classroom with his heart still beating twice as fast as normal. If anyone was watching him closely, they might have noticed that he was moving a little too quickly. His speed couldn't be explained away by his small, light form, or any apparent athleticism. What on earth is wrong with me? He ran by the music room and tugged his oboe from its place on the shelf. As he made his way over to Aldi, Izuku made a mental note to practice. The chaos was no excuse for laziness. Before Izuku rounded the corner that would lead him to the grocery store chain, he painstakingly peeked around it, trying to achieve the stealth that he'd only seen in comic books. Thankfully, he spotted a familiar crown of yellow hair. His stealth was for nothing. Ah, Izuku! All Might shouted warmly, ignoring Izuku's position halfway shielded by the opposite building. Out of surprise, Izuku immediately stepped forward. No, propelled himself forward. Then he forcefully planted his feet down, one after another, in a bad mimicry of real human steps. He was like a toddler testing out the gas on a motorcycle. He finally stopped, a hair's breadth away from All Might's hulking form. All Might, he greeted, voice small. Then, realizing his closeness, Izuku took a step backward, only to launch himself onto his posterior. Whoa there! Are you all right there, my boy? All Might asked. He extended a hand, having to bend down to reach Izuku's level. Izuku stared at the hand, and then his face scrunched up, the afterimage in his mind making him feel nauseous. Don't touch. Don't touch. His mind chanted. After a moment's hesitation, Izuku placed his hands on the pavement and pushed himself to his feet. Toshinori looked troubled, but he didn't say a word as he pulled back his outstretched hand. In a familiar hero's gesture, All Might placed a hand on his hip and gave Izuku a beaming smile. Do you know why I'm here today? Your voice is less personal, Izuku couldn't help but notice. Did you just get off of hero work? Izuku wondered. Aloud, and then hissed in a sharp breath. His face glowed red. He hadn't meant to say anything like that. Toshinori startled, and then appraised Izuku again. Is it that obvious? He laughed, posture loosening slightly. Izuku relaxed a fraction. Feeling emboldened, he asked, Why did we come to Aldi? The hero shrugged nonchalantly, scratching behind his head. To be honest, I move around a lot, so I'm not familiar with the location yet. You'll have to show me around, he said. I thought he was stationed here months ago, Izuku thought, frowning. It had been a long few months, so Izuku supposed he must have been overestimating the time frame. Anyway, today is the first day of your training. Izuku's brain sounded off like a screaming tea kettle. All Might had mentioned training, but Izuku never thought it would be now. Training? Izuku squeaked. Now. All Might gazed down at him. Is your quirk not an impediment to your daily life? Yes, but Izuku never thought he would want something as badly as he wanted this. It was a dream come true, so immaculate that he worried that he was daydreaming. But he was nervous. I'm not good enough. He felt defeated at the mere admittance. All Might let out a booming laugh, and Izuku nearly jumped out of his skin. My boy, what do you think training is for? He corrected, gentle training. It will be tailored just for you. You're something of an enigma. I guess, it's just that after what happened over the weekend, Izuku found it incredible how quickly All Might's face could change. His just amused expression morphed into stoniness, and he fixed Izuku with a stern look. Training is so we can avoid situations like that in the future, young Izuku. Now, it's getting late, so talk to me about your quirk while we go. So Izuku engrossed himself in observations and details he'd written and committed to memory. His quirks' outbursts were so many and varied that he could discuss them endlessly. He lost track of where they were walking, only observing that All Might chose not to use his special leaping power. Instead, to Izuku's slight disappointment, they boarded a bus. Izuku ignored the blur of scenery as it passed by his window. He had only begun to discuss his theories on the odd lack of physical backlash when All Might announced, "We're here." Izuku paused to look out the window, expecting to either be outside of All Might's personal apartment, or a training dojo or UA, something like that. But instead, he saw a sleek, tall building with tinted windows. "Where is this All Might?" he asked, curious. He'd never read anything on hero websites about a building like this. "This is our headquarters, where you'll be staying kept for a bit," All Might hummed, glancing at him out of the corner of his eye. Izuku started. "A bit? Don't I have to go to school and—" "All Might?" Izuku asked uncertainly. "Won't have to go to school anymore," All Might beamed. "Isn't that great?" Izuku stood from his seat. "Wait, All Might," he said, voice quavering just a little. "Did you ask my mom?" "Everything's been taken care of. Now, shoo," All Might cooed. "Let's go in and start your training." "You are All Might, aren't you?" All Might frowned, but slowly his mouth curved upward. "You are a shrewd child. So young. What a shame." Izuku watched in horror as All Might's jaw receded, hair blackened, body shrank away, until just a dark-complexioned young man was appraising Izuku with appreciation. "Did you like my disguise quirk? I find this one rather useful." Izuku screamed, and the black-haired man reached out a hand. Izuku jerked back, but not before two fingers touched his forehead, and his vision began to fade out. "No," he whimpered, white noise ringing in his ears. "What kind of ability?" "Don't worry. Once I'm through with you, you'll be my own little force of nature." Just before his consciousness faded altogether, he registered the man hoisting him into his arms, a warm hand running through his hair. Nausea filled him at the familiarity of the motion. Izuku fell asleep. Aizawa grimaced at the high-pitched scream filling the bus car. He looked around at the other passengers, but none of them were even glancing up, all engrossed in their books, music, conversations, whatever. Some kind of concealment quirk, Aizawa theorized. That must be why no one noticed. Still, why did he let himself get in this sort of situation? Sure, All Might had given him his card, but he detested communicating over the phone. So he'd sought out Izuku at his school, supposing that he'd find All Might for Aizawa sooner or later. Izuku had met up with someone, and that someone had surely looked like the hero All Might, but Aizawa couldn't contain his dread. Aizawa had, against his better nature, simply tailed them, listening in vaguely as the little grade schooler had talked All Might's ear off with quirk analysis rivaling that of the pros. It had all seemed so natural that Aizawa had nearly dismissed his sense of dread as overcaution. Almost. Until Izuku had screamed, wrenching his heart into a distorted, amorphous blob, and Aizawa watched as he was carried off the train by a dark-haired man who held him as tenderly as a father would. The kid's body was so tiny that he seemed to disappear into the villain's chest. Aizawa felt sick, jumped out of his chair as soon as the man's back was turned, and investigated their booth. There was no sign of All Might. Not even a wayward blonde hair signaled that All Might had ever been there at all. So it really wasn't. The hero kept a firm eye on the man's back, but his presence was, for lack of a better word, terrifying. Aizawa knew his limits, and with an aura like that, he'd never best that man. So, he slunk off the train alongside the dark-haired man and a slurry of other passengers, trying his best to conceal his own presence. Then he flipped open his phone, pulled out a little slip of cardstock from his front pocket, and did the only thing he could think of. He punched in the number that Aizawa had been trying his best to avoid. "Eraserhead here. Lose something?" There was a collective grunt as passengers hoisted themselves to their feet, preparing to disembark the bus. Aizawa watched the tall black-haired man cradling Izuku do the same. Whoever he was, Aizawa hated how natural he looked, with the bite-sized kid enveloped in his arms and drowning in the ruffles of his downy jacket. The man's eyes did not shift. His hands did not wander. His mouth did not pucker. To any bystander, he was the image of a doting father, looking down on his sleeping child with fondness and care. Yet, any trained hero could sense something lurking below the surface. An unabating bloodlust and undeniable confidence. The type of pride that only the youngest inexperienced upstarts or the oldest battle-worn masters dare to possess. Aizawa swore under his breath as the man disembarked with Izuku. He once again questioned All Might's sanity in choosing such a successor. In the stranger's arms, Izuku looked even younger than he was. The combination of Izuku's relaxed, soft features and the absence of his familiar furrowed brow and inquisitive gaze left the boy looking positively toddlerish. He waited until a half-dozen passengers were in between him and the man, then surreptitiously slunk off the bus. Aizawa's phone flickered, and he noticed a new message from All Might. W. Aizawa shook his head. He knew the text slang from Hizashi's endless barrage of messages, but receiving the shorthand acronym for On My Way from the number one hero made him question his career choices. He'd been doing that a lot lately. Ever since Aizawa had come into contact with All Might and experienced the full force of his successor's energy, whether from his quirk or just from Izuku himself, he'd been asking himself, why didn't I just choose a normal 9 to 5? Izuku's green head disappeared into a tall building, and Aizawa planted himself in a shadow near the bus stop. It wasn't Aizawa's first stakeout, but his inexplicable sense of dread had him on edge. Aizawa wasn't a stranger to fear. Contrary to popular belief, being afraid is a healthy signal of one's sense of self-preservation. He only felt uneasy with how permeating and unshakable the dark-haired man's brand of dread was. Even when he was far away, Aizawa felt like he needed to put more and more distance between them. He closed his eyes and tried to still himself. Breathing in quite deeply, Eraserhead, a voice beckoned. Aizawa jolted. All Might, he said curtly, turning around. A look of surprise crossed the top hero's face, and Aizawa felt a moment of satisfaction. He might be the only one in the whole world who would address All Might without a syrupy sweet tone, the sole voice in the world who would be curt to the number one hero. Not that he had anything against famous heroes. Underground heroes were just as good. All Might looked to his left, right, and around him. If you're looking for Izuku, he's not here, Aizawa said. All Might shook his head. From your texts, I did not suspect he'd be wandering around, All Might rumbled, assuming his classic, guttural Superman voice even now. No, I was looking for Cameron. They assaulted me on the way here, but I do not think they were able to keep up with my full sprint. Aizawa got satisfaction from that too. There were downsides to the limelight. For what reason? Well, I suppose there have been accounts of me walking the streets with Izuku. They wanted a name. The Erasure hero felt a wave of annoyance. You didn't give it to them, right? All Might was silent. I may have accidentally let slip. Well, I'm not absolutely sure what they heard, but Aizawa's face contorted. He was irritated despite himself. All Might, forgive my directness, but for someone who embodies the ideal of selflessness, you're being awfully selfish with this boy. You know that the press will never leave him alone now. Aizawa noticed something shift in All Might's face, a reaction that Aizawa couldn't read. He sensed that he was missing something but barreled forward anyways. You said he was, what, 8? With a mind like his, passion like his, a quirk like his? That boy? No, that child would have been wildly successful without your intervention. You aren't doing him any favors with your favoritism. If anything, you're robbing him of his future entirely. With the trauma he's already endured, I can't imagine what's to come. Top heroes always. He stopped himself, all too aware of how uncharacteristic his outburst was. What was it about Izuku that made him want to raise his voice? All Might had the good sense to look apologetic. It is complicated, Eraserhead. He cleared his throat. Now that you've agreed to tutor Izuku, I will explain the whole situation to you later. But right now, we have a duty to fulfill. Tutor. Aizawa's pallor, already whitish, had gone translucent. All Might raised his eyebrows. I assumed since you've been keeping tabs on him, and have rescued him twice now, that you intended to take my offer. And you speak so strongly in his defense. Eraserhead's mouth formed a line. Don't assume, All Might. I'm not here to serve you. All Might frowned again. Aizawa noticed how vulnerable he looked. Did he always wear his emotions on his sleeve, or was this another example of the Izuku effect? I'm not asking for service. I'm asking for a favor. I'm all too aware of my shortcomings when it comes to Izuku's safety. I need help. I know you're young and haven't been a hero for long, but no one is suited for the job but you. There were several beats of silence. Then, finally, All Might said, in any case, right now there is a more pressing matter. We must find Izuku. And just like that, they recollected themselves, and once again donned their hero personas. Izuku was underwater. Light and sounds bent and warped before they met his eyes and ears. It was nauseating, so he tried to curl into a ball, but found that his limbs wouldn't comply. Izuku, a voice sighed to his left. Izuku flinched. They followed us. All Might was on hero duty, so there must be someone else. Pity, I thought it was too improbable that he'd share the secret. I thought his sense of guilt and propriety would hold his tongue. Maybe he's not as moral as he'd like you to believe. The voice giggled. Izuku's mouth twitched. He realized that he'd tried to speak. Cold, but not wet. So he wasn't underwater, after all. His thoughts diffracted, much like the light around him. All Izuku knew at the moment was how afraid he was. Sorry, boy, I didn't want you to scream. Izuku felt another hand in his hair. It didn't feel as human as the previous hand on the bus. The fingers felt scaly and webbed, like some kind of reptile. I would have given you back your voice, but it seems we'll have to wait a bit longer for our quality family time, won't we? When Izuku finally opened his eyes, it felt like his eyelids were ripping apart like dry parchment paper. The black-haired man was careening over him, affection evident in his expression. But now a fin had sprouted along the base of his skull, and his eyes were green and pupilless, like a fish's eyes. Izuku tried to speak again, but only a whimper worked its way out of his throat. Shoo, Izuku. I will still help you. We still have some time before your knights come to your rescue. They're wasting time arguing about trivial matters. The man laughed again, then his face suddenly hardened. Is it wrong for me to want to know, Izuku? About your life? Your friends? Your newfound father figures? He gathered Izuku's limp body into another embrace. Izuku felt a strange tugging, not at anything physical, but within his chest. This power is not yours, Izuku. I wish this mistake had never happened. But I will be more attentive from now on. I will help HS this ugly energy. I hope the heroes you so admire have the good sense to thank me for it. I want to know more about your life. Are the children at school kind to you? What dish is your favorite? How do you and your mother celebrate your birthday? Do you still play the oboe? A bolt of electricity passed through Izuku's body, and new fear consumed him. I will know, from now on, everything about you. It was a mistake for me to leave you unattended. The dark-haired man's fish features receded, and his face morphed again. The sound was one of mutilation, cartilage and bone being broken and remolded, and Izuku wanted to look away. He was glued to the sight, though. Izuku found himself staring into a face he only remembered from photos. Izuku wished he could scream. Tears rolled down his cheeks. Whispers assaulted his ears, telling him things that he did not want to know. Mom said you were dead. Their plan was set. It was simple and probably too obvious. All Might would storm from the front, using his notoriety and size to draw attention. All Might could tell that Aizawa detested it. Naturally, he liked thinking up unusual plans that would catch the enemy off guard. All Might had grown used to cliché, full-force invasions. His power was great enough that he could strong-arm an enemy into SBMsen without any tactics at all. All Might was glad to do things the way Eraserhead wanted. But their options were limited. Hizashi was busy, not responding to any texts, and they couldn't contact any other heroes without drawing undue attention to Izuku. If Izuku was conscious, well, he would be a force of nature. Compound his unusual tenacity and power with his unusual connection with the #1 hero, and, well, you've got a first-page headline. Assuming the media doesn't already have one, All Might thought ruefully, remembering his slip-up earlier. He tried to clear his mind from the overwhelming amount of worry swimming through it. One for all flared up, and for the first time, All Might wondered how much longer the quirk would remain blazing within him. It was something that Nana had never discussed with him. Toshinori had lost her before they had a chance to discuss the turnover rate. What would happen to the world if All Might suddenly vanished from it? All Might shuddered. With power like his, it wasn't often that he contemplated his own mortality. For so long, One for All had provided him with nearly unlimited strength. He shook the thoughts away, flexing his muscles and ramming himself through the door of the tall black building. All Might's anger soared again, as he remembered who he was fighting for. A receptionist stared at him. "See, can I help you, sir?" All Might's body was red-hot. He'd blasted through the door with enough energy and tenacity to send ripples through the floors and ceilings. The room turned to face him. A sea of bland people and collared button-downs stared in shock. He looked to the left and the right. No signs of villainy, but All Might supposed it could be a facade. In his pocket, his phone came to life with a message from Eraserhead. 238. A room number? Toshinori wondered. Sir, are you looking for someone?" the receptionist inquired. He was a well-put-together young man, wearing a white and gray suit. His eyes widened when he realized who he was looking at. Did a man holding a little boy check in recently? One with green hair? All Might asked against his better nature. "Ah, are you looking for the Midoriyas?" All Might's chest tightened. They were here. The receptionist glanced over at his monitor, scrolling a few times. "Midoriya Izuku is in room 238, he declared, voice quivering a bit. "Who is the room checked out under?" "Midoriya Izuku?" "Izuku is 8 years old, friend. He can't buy a hotel room." "What is the name of the adult with him?" The receptionist shifted nervously, eyeing the telephone. "We have the room out under Izuku. I don't remember the man's name. If there's an issue, I can call?" All Might tensed, feeling the mood in the room shift. "No. Thank you," he responded, hurrying towards the elevator. Curious eyes bore into his back. When All Might finally made it to room 238, the door was slightly ajar. He leapt across the threshold, finding Aizawa crouched near the space heater. All Might nearly gasped when he saw Izuku. Izuku's small fists were balled into fists. His hair was sticky and clumped together with sweat, and his lip was crusted over with black blood. Had he bitten it himself? All Might raced to the child's side, and when Eraserhead's neck snapped up, he saw concern etched into the younger hero's expression. "Is he okay?" All Might half yelled. Aizawa put a finger to his lips, motioning for All Might to be quiet. "He's only sleeping," he replied, but it was too late. Izuku's eyes twitched, then fluttered open. All Might would never forget, as long as he lived, the terror he saw buried in those green eyes. Then it was gone. Izuku sat up in a flash of motion, and the air seemed to crackle. "All Might!" Izuku beamed. Then, with even more surprise, Eraserhead-san. Izuku jumped into the air so quickly that he seemed to vanish. Then, he was cracking All Might's ribs with a deep hug. All Might felt like crying, feeling his short, spindly limbs wrapped around his torso. "Are you okay, my boy?" The green-haired child pulled away slightly and stared at All Might with his huge eyes. "Of course," he declared. Then Izuku seemed to reassess the situation. Conspiratorially, he asked, "Did something bad happen?" All Might blanched. "Izuku, my boy, you were snatched from outside your elementary school." Eraserhead here. All Might put a hand on Aizawa's shoulder. "Noticed that something was amiss and led me here to rescue you. It seems your assailant has fled. Wasn't there someone here with you?" Izuku's brow furrowed, and All Might felt his heart expand despite himself at the familiar expression. I don't, Izuku inhaled. "I'm not sure. I'm sorry, All Might." Toshinori and Aizawa exchanged glances. There was confusion, but mostly dread. "Are you injured?" All Might asked again, but this time, he was thinking about what might be lurking under Izuku's skin. Had his kidnapper placed some sort of tracking device? "No, All Might." Izuku trailed off and then dislodged himself from the golden-haired hero. His eyes were shining with excitement as he rushed toward Aizawa. You rescued me, Eraserhead-san? How did you know I was missing? Did you use the eraser quirk? We're there. Aizawa held up a hand, and Izuku instantly fell silent. All Might noticed Aizawa raise an eyebrow. He was probably noting how compliant Izuku was to his wishes. Later, was all Eraserhead said. There would be a later thing. Toshinori thought about the momentary terror he'd seen in Izuku's eyes. He was grateful Izuku was unharmed, of course, but he could only imagine what had been done to Izuku in the short time he'd been in that kidnapper's clutches. And, somehow, the man had affected Izuku's memories of the crime. There must be a reason. All Might was sure that it wasn't the last they'd seen of the kidnapper. Toshinori watched Izuku bounce up and down, several feet off the floor, as the three of them trailed out of the room. He thought about Izuku's potential. Aizawa was right. All Might had set something in motion. This little child, who only came up to Eraserhead's waist, would become a force of nature. Now, they could only make sure little Izuku was ready for the trials set in front of him. Shoto tried to stop himself from trembling. But whenever his father faced him head-on, directing 100% of his rage in one single direction, well, it was difficult to stay stoic. Shoto, Endeavor growled. Stop trembling, you coward. It's time. For what, father? Shoto asked, voice quite small. The number 2 hero seemed even angrier than usual. I created you to be strong, to be capable, to be unbeatable, to succeed where I have failed. You have never. Do not interrupt me, Endeavor roared, and fire singed Shoto's cheek. He shrunk away. Even when you disappoint me, do not forget your sole purpose in life. Endeavor paused, and for a moment, the heat in the room lessened. Then it returned, more urgent than ever. A confidant of mine says that All Might has chosen a successor. Shoto heard nothing but white noise for a beat. He remembered all the bruises, cuts, and scrapes, all the screaming and blaming. And every time Endeavor repeated, "You will beat him. All Might's successor." This is earlier than I could have expected or hoped, Endeavor continued. But you know what this means. He did. Shoto had been born for this. His fear left him, replaced with deep, desperate determination. This was his chance to earn his father's respect. Maybe, just maybe, if he succeeded, his father would stop hurting everyone so much. You will not disappoint me this time, Endeavor rumbled. You will destroy him. You will burn into his memory who is superior.